There's a lonely stretch of road in remote northwestern British Columbia, Canada, having a huge number of unsolved missing and murdered women cases. It spans 450 miles between the small cities of Prince George in the province's interior and Prince Rupert on the Pacific coast. Over the past 40 years, more than 40 women mysteriously disappeared or died from foul play in that area. Most of their circumstances remain unknown. Prince Rupert is a small port city of around 12,500 people on Canada's west coast. During summer, temperatures often hover around the mid-teens, but winters can be cruel, with averages often dipping well below freezing. As well as being the transport and shipping hub for British Columbia's north coast, it also happens to receive less sunshine than any other place in the country. What's interesting is that, for the most part, the road is only a bit of infrastructure on either side of you. It's just endless wilderness that's eerie and mysterious. It's really just this one vein running through the whole area. The Highway of Tears is a section of the larger Trans-Canada Yellowhead Highway. Despite its dark past, it remains a lifeline for the towns it connects in western British Columbia, many of which, like Prince Rupert, have large Indigenous populations. For the people who live there, everyone's lost someone to the highway, not only to the victims on the Highway of Tears, but also those lost to road accidents or who simply go missing, never to be found. There's a whole culture around the road, and because it's the only way to get from one place to another, it's such a crucial part of life. Even if you grow up with it, it has a strange value. The Highway of Tears murders and the women's suspicious disappearances began in 1969. They continue today, with the last case of modus operandi similarities happening in December 2018. Although the police officially remain cautious about confirming links, many in the know suspect that there may be many more crimes with victims fitting the mold. In 2005, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the RCMP, formed a task force called E-PANA to look at the area's unsolved mysteries and murdered women's cases. The RCMP is Canada's federal force having jurisdiction across the nation and in that region. The task force initially identified 18 cases, but soon expanded their investigation to include similar files eastward along Route 16 to Hinton, Alberta, as well as south along Highway 97 to Kamloops, British Columbia, and along Highway 5 from Merritt to Clearwater. Two significant independent government inquiries or investigations into the Highway of Tears and related matters also happened. One was a British Columbia provincial symposium held in 2006. The other was a recent national commission called the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry. It's called that because many victims were of Indigenous or First Nations ethnicity. Despite the massive police and public effort, no one's been caught for most of the crimes. As well, many of the victims' bodies remain hidden or undiscovered. These left people wondering if there was a loose serial killer on the Highway of Tears. Without exception, every victim in the Highway of Tears sphere is female. That includes confirmed murders as well as unsolved disappearances. Another harsh fact is many victims originated from Aboriginal or First Nations backgrounds. It's a reality that can't be overlooked. Project E-PANA, named so after the Inuit spirit that guides souls to the afterlife, used 4 criteria to qualify a murder or suspicious disappearance as a Highway of Tears case. These parameters were sound and valid, as many homicide and missing persons cases in the North have other circumstances that don't suggest a commonality the Highway of Tears files have. Out of great precaution, investigators are very careful about using the serial killer word. To be on the Highway of Tears list, the E-PANA victim profiles are female, high-risk lifestyle, known to hitchhike, and found or last seen near Highway 16, 97, or 5. Females who hitchhike and practice high-risk lifestyle around this remote road network are easy prey. Many come from physical, sexual, and substance abusive backgrounds. Many are sex workers and drug users, as well as having alcoholic tendencies and serious mental or emotional disorders. And many women victims are from indigenous communities with a host of social problems. Police investigators feel most, if not all, Highway of Tears cases are stranger-to-stranger relationships. The police don't like the serial killer term because of public ramifications, but it's a classic serial killer pattern to pick up strangers and have their way. Most lone operating killers leave little evidence behind at their crime scenes, take little with them, make sure there are no independent witnesses, and they rarely confess. That combination makes these predators so hard to catch. First Nations women are particularly vulnerable. Along the main Highway of Tears' stretch, from Prince Rupert to Prince George, there are 23 different Indigenous communities or reserves. Most of these little places have few facilities like medical services, educational outlets, and recreational opportunities. As well, poverty is a gigantic problem in Canada's First Peoples settlements. They simply can't afford private transportation. Combined with personal issues and the need to be mobile, many at-risk women are alone on the side of the road with their thumb out. They're perfect opportunities for men with deviant desire. One of these opportunistic killers was Cody Legebokoff. Cody Allen Legebokoff seemed like a regular Canadian kid. At 6 foot 2 inches and 220 pounds, he was made for sports and has spent much of his young life snowboarding and playing hockey in North British Columbia's Fort St. James area. After high school, he became a mechanic at a Ford dealership in nearby Prince George. He started dating a new girlfriend, seriously enough that the then 20-year-old spent Thanksgiving 2010 with the young lady and her family. But Cody Legebokoff allegedly had a secret life, and that wasn't just limited to the hours he spent online, where friends on social networking sites, including Nexopia, knew him as One Country Boy. He was accused of having murdered 3 adult women and a 10th grade girl over 2009 and 2010. 15-year-old Lauren Leslie had told her mother she was going out for coffee with a friend when she left their Fraser Lake home one fall afternoon in 2010. This friend may have been Cody Legebokoff. Lauren's mother, Donna Leslie, has told CBC News that she thinks her daughter had become familiar with Legebokoff online, then met up with him at a party. Her father, Doug Leslie, recalls that Lauren had hundreds of online friends who she'd never met in person, and that after her disappearance, a few of them even came forward to tell him that his daughter had helped them to resist suicide. Lauren's girlfriend, Charity Funk, said she'd never heard of Cody Legebokoff, but that Lauren may have known him through classmates. Late on November 27, 2010, 2 Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers, one from Fort St. James and one from Vanderhoof, met on a deserted road off Highway 27 to update each other on their jointly patrolled area. When they saw a GMC pickup truck speeding on an old logging road that they knew was used for illegal hunting, they pulled the driver over. They then asked a local game warden to help confirm their poaching suspicions by tracking whatever animal its driver, Cody Legebokoff, might have been hunting. What they found in the fresh snow wasn't deer or elk. It was the body of Lauren Leslie. Lauren Dawn Leslie was legally blind, with 50% vision in her better eye. Family and friends recall her as loving and trusting, but tough and principled. When the Chaco Valley Secondary School officials wouldn't give her and her girlfriend a couple's discount to a school dance, they wore gay pride t-shirts in protest and braved the taunts of classmates. Ironically, she wanted to be a forensic pathologist when she grew up. And the Leslies and Legebokoffs distantly knew each other. The victims and the accused grandparents were part of overlapping social groups. Donna Leslie says she feels sorry for Legebokoff and his family. Once they discovered Lauren Leslie, there were other bodies that investigators would soon connect to the case. The other 3 victims that prosecutors wanted to tie to Cody Legebokoff might not draw everyone's sympathy quite so readily as did the teenage girl Mounties first stumbled on. The Canadian press has alleged that Jill Stuchenko, Cynthia Maz, and Natasha Montgomery were sex workers. 35-year-old Jill Stuchenko wanted to be a singer. The single mother worked for Ricky Black at her Prince George escort agency, Black Orchid, for 10 years. She pulled extra shifts for other agencies and, according to her boss, freelanced on the streets. Stuchenko allegedly battled a drug problem. Friends and family reported Stuchenko missing October 22, 2009. 5 days later, she turned up dead in a gravel pit near Otway Road at the edge of Prince George. Cynthia Maz's story was similar. Like Stuchenko, she was a 35-year-old single mother. Friends reported her missing September 23, 2010. Her body was found on the banks of the Fraser River in L.C. Gunn Park, which the Globe and Mail asserts was frequented by sex workers, on October 9, 2010. Multiple newspapers quote Maz's family as describing her as a poster child for vulnerability in our society, and decrying her unprotected position as a social victim of disability, ethnicity, class, and gender. 23-year-old Natasha Montgomery was reported missing the same day as Maz. She had been a figure skater and a baseball player, and she was another young mother and alleged sex worker. When her family in Quesnel didn't hear from her for a few weeks, they called the RCMP. Authorities haven't found Montgomery's body, but they've said that they've been able to connect her to Cody Legebokoff and that they have enough evidence to charge him with her murder. Many in his remote corner of British Columbia are shocked. Others will wonder if they should have realized something was wrong. Cody Legebokoff's family was well known around Fort St. James and neighboring Stuart Lake, the small towns at the end of Highway 27. His mother's family, the Goodwins, owned one of Stuart Lake's 3 sawmills. They sold the company's timber rights in a multi-million-dollar deal in 2009. Legebokoff graduated from Fort St. James Secondary in 2008. His brother graduated a few years later. His sister graduated there too. His father was his hockey coach. Grandfather Roy Goodwin tells the press that Cody was popular, a good boy who liked to fish for trout and hunt grouse. But an anonymous friend told Maclean's magazine that Cody Legebokoff has always had a knack for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Until 2010, that just meant he'd been in a few bar fights. He had no criminal record prior to accusations that he murdered 4 women. He hadn't seemed like a young man with a vendetta against women. At the time of his arrest, not only was he dating a young lady who was studying at the College of New Caledonia, but he was living with 3 female friends in Prince George. Looking back, though, one friend points to at least one piece of potentially strange behavior. An anonymous source told the National Post newspaper that Legebokoff abruptly disappeared for a few weeks just before Lauren Leslie's murder, and that he has never explained his absence to friends. Investigators, led by RCMP Inspector Brendan Fitzpatrick, sorted through Cody Legebokoff's 2009 and 2010 activities. Authorities immediately charged Cody Legebokoff with first-degree murder after finding Lauren Leslie's body. The 3 additional murder charges came on October 17, 2011. Legebokoff's use of social networking and dating sites and the text messages he sent from his Android phone are among the focuses of the Mounties investigation. They spent weeks examining the truck he was driving when he was pulled over and searched the 2 homes he lived in, and they've sent the remains of Lauren Leslie and Cynthia Maz to Pennsylvania for special forensic analysis not available in Canada. Legebokoff's trial on 4 counts of murder was originally scheduled to begin in September 2013, but was delayed a month until October and then again until June 2014. Legebokoff pleaded not guilty to all 4 counts of murder. The judge and 12 jurors heard testimony from 93 Crown witnesses and the defendant. Legebokoff testified during his trial that he was involved in 3 of the deaths, but claimed that he did not commit the killings. He alleged that a drug dealer and 2 accomplices, whom he would only name as X, Y, and Z, were the actual murderers. Prosecutors did not accept this attempt to plead guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder. Legebokoff was convicted on 4 counts of second-degree murder on September 11, 2014, and on September 16, 2014, Legebokoff was sentenced to life in prison with no parole for 25 years. He was added to the National Sex Offender Registry, given the sexual assaults committed as part of the murders, and Legebokoff's apparent degradation of the victims' bodies. In February 2015, Legebokoff filed an appeal due to decisions against the change of venue and the defendant's legal representation. In September 2016, all 3 judges in the British Columbia Court of Appeal case endorsed the original judge's decision. Legebokoff was originally imprisoned at the Kent Institution, but was transferred in March 2019 to the Warkworth Institution. Let's just hope that they don't release this one too, as we've seen in so many of my past videos.
Generally, priests are figures of comfort and forgiveness, but they may represent a symbol that triggers brutal aggression for some people. So it appeared when the police came upon a bloody crime scene in a cottage in the village of Shorne, Kent, around midnight on March 21, 1975. Father Anthony Crean, 64, lay dead in a bathtub, still fully dressed, the water around him red with blood from the open wounds to his head. A series of crimson splatters on the bathroom walls and ceiling indicated repetitive blows. However, it had taken him some time to die, as if the offender had wanted to watch the effects of his handiwork for as long as possible. It appeared that the priest had been hit with the sharp edge of an axe, splitting open his skull and exposing his brain. He'd been repeatedly stabbed as well, and there were fresh bruises all over his face. From all appearances, there was something deeply personal about this assault. Father Crean had been the chaplain for a Carmelite convent and was a friendly sort. He believed that showing the love of Christ to wayward people could transform them. In 1973, he had shown a great deal of patience and kindness towards a young man who had then turned around, broken into his home, and robbed him. But like the benevolent priest in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, who gave the escaped convict Jean Valjean the silver that he'd initially stolen, Father Crean continued to be tolerant. That was a dire mistake, for the same man found him an easy target when anger overcame the man he befriended. The only book devoted to this unfolding horror, Psychopath, was penned by Tim Clark and John Pennicate, a team of journalists who had developed a controversial documentary on a legal and mental health care system that had failed to properly assess and treat a disturbed young man who eventually became a killer. Other writers addressed the case in the context of the 1970s, and Brian King includes some of the offender's writings in Lustmord, his collection of artifacts for murderers, although they're all taken from Pennicate and Clark's book. It did not take the police long to find the perpetrator of this bloody crime because they knew about the priest's association with a neighborhood troublemaker. Within 48 hours, they had located him and placed him under arrest. He immediately confessed, offering unbelievable details about how he had watched the priest die. But it turned out that this bludgeoning was only the most recent of a long list of crimes, including other murders. What this man had to say for himself provides a stark study in the psychology of a psychopath. It also poses a question to the field of risk assessment. Although the murder occurred in the 1970s, the ability to predict violence is not an exact science. When arrested, Patrick David Mackay told the police that he was a gardener, but he was currently without a job. The truth was, he'd had several jobs, none of which he could keep. He lived in London, he said, although he actually had no home. Only 23, he'd seen and done a lot, most of it sordid and violent. Born on September 25, 1952, in England, he grew up in the home of a man who was an aggressive and violent alcoholic. Undoubtedly, Harry Mackay was unhappy in his occupation as an accountant and with his poor economic circumstances, which only worsened with his illness. On a routine basis, he would get drunk, come home to his wife, accusing her of imagined offenses, and beat her up. In later years, the former World War II veteran would also turn on his son, although Mackay claims that he never touched the two girls, Mackay's sisters. The man was so distant and unloving that Mackay recalled only one pleasant interlude with him. When Mackay was 10, his father died from the complications of alcoholism and a weak heart, leaving home in peace, but in a struggle to survive. Harry's final words to his son had been, "Remember to be good," an ironic admonition from a man who'd made his son's life a nightmare. Yet Mackay was nevertheless traumatized. Not allowed to view his father's corpse or attend his funeral, he could not come to terms with the loss. He began to tell people that his father was still alive and kept a photograph of Harry close to him at all times. He likely felt extreme guilt over having wished his father dead on so many violence-filled nights, and he might have believed that he caused it in some way. For a 10-year-old, that's a heavy burden, and not one that he's going to lighten by telling someone else. Over the next few years, Patrick alienated those who might have given him solace. Often filthy from poverty and neglect, and socially isolated, he developed into a bully against younger children, usually when a victim decides to transform into someone with power. Also, Mackay suffered from extreme tantrums and fits of anger. Antisocial behavior like this develops through specific steps. Children are initially benign, and from his research among violent criminals in prison, he determined that people became violent through 4 stages of what he terms violentization. They are brutalization and subjugation, belligerency, violent coaching, and criminal activity. First, the person, usually a child, becomes a victim of violence and feels powerless to avoid it, as did Mackay. He or she experiences fear and humiliation, especially as the violence is repeated, along with his helplessness. Yet, as he watches his tormentor, he learns how and when to become violent, as well as how to profit from it. It's not long before he has sufficient exposure to act on the impulse himself as a way of taking charge and inflicting on others what was imposed on him. His array of choices narrows to the one that appears to him to be the most potent, and he'll often adopt it. This model certainly fits Mackay's development. Patrick Mackay was known in school as a liar and a troublemaker. He also turned his violence against small animals, including the family's pet tortoise, which he repeatedly set on fire. One woman claimed that she had seen him pin birds to the road and then stand back to watch cars come by and crush them. Besides, he followed in his father's footsteps by drinking, which inspired him towards greater aggression. He stole from people on the street and entered elderly women's apartments to take what he could find. He also set fire to a Catholic church, as well as other buildings. Mackay had a fascination with death. Apparently, his father had regaled him with stories from the war about seeing his comrades shot down or blown up. Mackay himself spent a lot of time with the corpses of animals and birds. A neighbor saw him toss dead birds into the air and play with them. He likely developed fantasies that involved the death process, which may have then become eroticized for him. One person said that he'd asked about whether his father's bones were rotting in the ground. His mother, Marion, allowed the state to place Mackay in several different facilities for disturbed boys. Still, she finally had him removed and reunited with the family, against psychiatric advice, and she took her 3 children to Guyana. But that was short-lived. The family did not settle well there, and soon they were back in London. They moved in with Harold Mackay's sisters, and family fights became the norm. Marion then moved to Gravesend's town, and Mackay got 2 short-lived jobs before going on public assistance. He continued to bully people. A probation officer predicted serious violence if Mackay was not removed from the home, but others who knew the case decided to wait and see. Not long afterward, Mackay attempted to strangle his mother and commit suicide. He told officials who questioned him that he lived with his father and often saw snakes. He was again evaluated for mental illness and again released. After that, he tried to kill a younger boy. He later said he'd have finished the job had he not been restrained. Mackay soon ended up in the first of several psychiatric institutions and was finally recognized for what he was. A Home Office psychiatrist, Dr. Leonard Carr, examined his history and described him as a cold, psychopathic killer. He was only 15. There were 3 possible hospitals in Britain with special security protocols where Mackay could have been sent for incarceration and an indefinite period of treatment. In October 1968, he was committed to Moss Side Hospital in Liverpool as a diagnosed psychopath. There, he went through a battery of tests to prepare him for therapy. Psychiatrists examined his bullying behavior, cruelty to animals, tendency to steal, truancy, social withdrawal, and penchant for setting fires. He'd been in trouble with the law by age 11 when he'd taken things from a neighbor and blamed someone else. The doctors also noted that his mother had been hospitalized for 4 months after nervous breakdown, which must have made him feel utterly abandoned at home, coupled with his father's death. And there was an early probation report from juvenile court to the effect that the probation officer could not even comprehend the situation sufficiently to recommend a straightforward way to handle it. This official had believed that the boy would grow out of his fits eventually, but it seemed clear to the experts that Mackay's anger and aggression were probably his way of surviving, and the home environment just made them worse. Over and over, it seemed that officials had ignored the red flags that signaled increasing violence in this child. But this team of psychiatrists was hopeful that he might be turned around. From a test of his brainwaves, he was found to be within normal levels for those factors that, during the 1970s, were believed to be involved in antisocial disorders. Nevertheless, one psychiatrist thought that he had a genetic defect inherited from his father that made him likely to be a psychopathic. The disturbing relationship with his mother was supposed to exacerbate this tendency. Some of his more violent fits had been around her. There was no diagnosis for intermittent explosive disorder, now in the 4th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This is considered a disorder of impulse control in which there are aggressive outbursts, assaults, and property destruction well out of proportion to any stressors. Mackay certainly fits this pattern. While sometimes it seems uncharacteristic of the person, there are often lesser incidents of aggression between the more intense outbursts. In any event, even during shorter stays at other hospitals and treatment centers between the ages of 11 and 14, several doctors believed that Mackay ought to be admitted for substantial inpatient observation where he could undergo therapy. Most thought he was quite disturbed. Oddly, Mackay would take a doll to bed with him at night and pressure people to kiss it. He was clearly immature, and one psychiatrist even believed that the damage done to him was irreversible. Another predicted that he was a potential murderer of women. Most of them blamed his mother's ineffectual skills and her indifference to his problems. But then, it was an age in which mothers took most of the blame for childhood disorders. Often, where ignorance prevailed on causal factors, the easiest target was mom. The mental health experts believed that Mackay was a psychopath without mania. In other words, he had a character disorder but was not considered psychotic. An independent tribunal who interviewed him saw nothing wrong, most likely because what's wrong with such people doesn't manifest in prominent appearances or behaviors. Mackay went through 2 extended periods of hospitalization in this place and was twice released, despite psychiatric fears that he might be dangerous. His tendency towards violence was assisted by his growing obsession with the philosophies of Nazism. Nazism, a version of fascism, was the ideology of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, led by Adolf Hitler, referred to as the Führer. It refers most commonly to a period from 1933 to 1945, when the Nazi Party was in power, the Third Reich. Adherents believed that great nations developed from strong military force, so Hitler called on Germany to stand firm and become more aggressive as a proud nation. Hitler and his followers viewed Aryan, blonde-haired Caucasians as the superior race, so they supported a strong heterosexual race supremacy at the expense of other groups, such as Jews, Gypsies, and homosexuals, who they perceived as inferior. They blamed Germany's deterioration on such people mingling with the purebreds and deemed that these mongrels were not lebenswertes, or worthy of life. While the philosophy of Nazism was outlawed in Germany after Hitler's defeat in World War II, here and there political groups have revived the ideas as neo-Nazis. The belief that certain races are superior persists, warranting both arrogance and aggression as a birthright. Mackay worshipped Hitler, write Lane and Gregg, dubbing himself Franklin Bollwoldt I. He made himself a crude uniform, sticking emblems symbolic of the Nazi regime and purchasing stormtrooper boots. He considered himself quite powerful and believed that he would one day change the world. In The Gates of Janus, Ian Brady, the British child killer with his late accomplice Myra Hindley, committed the famous Moors murders, comments on serial killing and ideology. He was inspired by Austrian philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche to become nihilistic, disdainful of others, and assured of his own superiority. From his vantage point, having committed murders in the same country and just a decade before Mackay, he offers a perspective on the motives of others like himself. Most people observe moral, legal, and ethical boundaries for immediate personal comfort or from timidity. The criminal is more attracted and stimulated by the excitement of challenging the norm, of stepping into forbidden territory like a solitary explorer, consciously thirsting to experience that which the majority have not and dare not. He refers to this approach as spiritually switching on the dark. The forbidden is a natural attractant, and some people who move toward it with ease possess advanced criminal potential. The serial killer lacks the patience to compromise and bear the stultifying lassitude of ordinary modern life. He wants more now, in what is clearly perceived as an extremely uncertain and short life. Once a person has committed his first or second act of murder unchallenged, Brady says, he will gradually accept his own acts as normal or supranormal. He has created a microcosmic state of his own in which he alone governs, becoming as careless with other people's lives as are most rulers. He is, in effect, a mirror of certain societies that value power over human life. Mackay was released from Moss Side at the age of 20 in 1972. It wasn't long before the real trouble began. Having learned no legitimate skills, Mackay tried and failed at a few jobs but wanted to be independent of his mother. Around this time, his sister was admitted to another institution after a psychotic breakdown that she blamed on him. So that made at least 4 members of the family of 5 who had a history of psychological imbalances. Mackay moved in with his friends in London and spent most of his time in a drunken state or drugs. He had tried to live with his mother and found that he could not, in part, because she gave him grief about not paying for his board. But he also had difficulty with everyone else with whom he tried to live, including his aunts and friends. Because of his moods, threats, and irresponsibility, they all ended up wanting him out. Among the things that frightened others was Mackay's habit of building the Frankenstein monsters models from Mary Shelley's novel, sticking pins in it and burning out the eyes. He continued to be fascinated with the Nazis and would wear his homemade uniform, complete with an armband, and set about collecting Nazi books and memorabilia. He was fascinated by the extermination of the Jews and worried about his own mixed blood. Next to his bed, he kept a picture of Himmler. Having no particular long-term goals, he met sporadically with his caseworker, who gave up attempting to set appointment times. He often lost his jobs. At times, he burglarized homes to get some food, cigarettes, and money. He had few friends, but then he met Father Crean. Mackay was walking in the woods near his mother's home when he came across a Carmelite convent, the home of 8 nuns who took in geriatric patients. Father Crean and his dog lived in a cottage nearby. He made it a point to befriend people who looked like they needed a friend, and Mackay fit that category. But no one can really befriend a psychopath. They did not have the emotions required for real bonding. Crean bought Mackay a drink in a local pub, and eventually they were meeting there regularly. But Mackay couldn't resist his criminal impulses, so he broke into the priest's home and stole a check for £30. Crean reported it, and Mackay was arrested. Crean did not wish to prosecute, but the police did, so the case went to court, and Mackay was ordered to repay the priest. He said he would, but never did, so it became a source of contention between them. Significantly, since Mackay had changed the original 30 into 80, so he owed his friend a substantial sum. This incident caused a rift between them, and Mackay returned to London. He went through a succession of jobs and places to stay, ended up in jail, and was given a small fine and a suspended sentence for yet more criminal conduct. In short, he got away with more aggression, in part because the system simply did not know what to do with someone with his erratic and potentially dangerous temperament. They had no resources for it and no way to warrant detaining him. It's possible that by this time, Mackay had already killed 5 people, doing so in the final months of 1973. He later admitted to drowning a tramp in the River Thames, but the police suspected him in other violent incidents. No charges were filed on these, as no evidence connected Mackay to them. But for a murder in February 1974, it was a different story. That month, Mackay followed his usual course of breaking and entering when he went into a home in the Chelsea area of London. There, he encountered 84-year-old Isabella Griffiths. The accounts differ here. Some say that she was walking down the street, carrying bags of groceries, and when Mackay helped her, she invited him in, and they struck up a friendship. Others indicate that she was at home when he broke in and gave no indication that she knew him previously. By one account, anyway, Ms. Griffiths apparently was familiar with him, and Mackay eventually chose her home as a point of robbery. Just after the incident, he had tried committing suicide but was picked up by the police. A psychiatrist spoke with him and concluded that he was not mentally ill, despite his extensive psychiatric observation record. He believed that Mackay had a personality disorder and ordered him to a ward for observation. Mackay seemed to adjust quickly, so more extended detention was not deemed necessary. He was released from the hospital on February 14th, and he was now more dangerous than he'd ever been. He went directly to the home of Isabella Griffiths, who told him she did not need any assistance that day. He pushed his way in anyway and, in a matter of moments, had strangled her. There was no apparent reason for it, other than the fact that he was angry that she had not invited him inside when he arrived. He dragged her body into the kitchen, wandered around for a bit, and then decided to take out his wrath for imagined insults by mutilating her corpse. He found a 12-inch kitchen knife and stabbed her in the stomach, leaving the knife in her. Feeling better, he grabbed some food and drink and listened to the radio in her front room. The place was his now, for the time being. He intended to enjoy it. Then, oddly, he considered killing himself, or so he later said. He removed the knife from the body and looked at it. Then he changed his mind. In a strange mood now, he arranged the corpse for greater comfort, closing the eyes and covering it. Then he placed dishes into the sink, along with some shoes, and turned on the water. Stealing only a cigarette lighter, he took the knife, left the house, and tossed the weapon into some bushes along the way. Ms. Griffith's body lay on the floor for nearly 2 weeks before someone found her. Oddly, the police thought she had died from natural causes, even though she had clearly been covered by someone else. Then police discovered the stab wound, and the case was turned over to homicide detectives, the murder squad. They appealed to the public for information, but few people knew the victim, and there were no clues at the scene, so the case went unsolved. Once again, Mackay had gotten away with violence. There would be more. During the next year, Mackay took hospitality from a grudging social worker ordered to take him in. According to this man, who asked to remain anonymous, Mackay would talk endlessly about his violent fantasies and wonder if he was possessed by demons. He pondered dark subjects, and eventually, to the social worker's relief, he was forced to leave his home. Once again, he was on the streets, begging from relatives, none of whom wanted him near them. He went back to the social worker, robbed him, and was arrested once again. He served 4 months in prison and was soon released. By then, he'd had time to form a plan to pay society back for its neglect of people like him. At first, he mugged women, often charming them into trusting him, and then deciding to find out where the elderly rich women lived to rob their homes. He had not forgotten how easy it was to gain entry into Isabella Griffith's house. Mackay apparently enjoyed the feeling of power he derived from killing her because, on March 10, 1975, he knocked on the door at the home of Adele Price, age 89. He came up behind her as she was opening the door of the house where several people resided in separate flats. She offered him a glass of water, so he followed her into her flat. She engaged Mackay in some conversation first. As she got the water for him, he came up behind her and strangled her, letting her fall on the floor face down. she still wore her overcoat. Mackay later reported in a confession that this murder had given him a peculiar feeling that lasted for several days and had something in common with the other murders he'd committed. It had no motive whatsoever. It is unclear what Mackay might have meant by peculiar. Afterward, he lay down on Ms. Price's couch and took a nap. He was woken by the sound of someone trying to come in, the victim's granddaughter, who also lived there. When she couldn't enter, she went to call from a hallway phone, and Mackay ran out, passing her on the stairs. But because others lived in the house, there was no reason for her to remember him. Adele Price's death was initially believed to have been the result of a heart attack, but suspicious things about the apartment soon changed its status to murder. Because Mackay had no connection to the victim, the police had difficulty finding a perpetrator, so the crime went unsolved and Mackay continued on his deadly way. Mackay went in and out of yet another mental institution because he tried to kill himself, and 5 days after he killed Adele Price, he was ready to do it again. After being teased by friends over his former association with Father Crean, which they hinted had been a homosexual liaison, Mackay decided to go to Kent and find the priest. He had a plan for putting an end to this derisive talk. On Friday, February the 21st, he sought out Crean and killed him. In his confession, Mackay described his experience that day. He had taken 2 knives with him on the train from London, so he was prepared this time. He went first to his mother's home and told her to cook a chicken he'd brought. Then he walked down to the convent. He claimed that Father Crean's door was slightly ajar, so he entered and called to his former friend. When Crean saw him, he attempted to leave, but Mackay stopped him. They struggled, rousing Mackay's anger, so he attacked. First, he used his fist to punch the priest in the face. Crean got loose and ran into the back room, probably to lock himself inside. Mackay caught up to him before he could manage it, pushing his way in and causing Crean to fall backward into the bathtub. Mackay continued to hit him with his hand and then used a knife to stab him in the neck and side of the head, but when he tried shoving the blade into the top of Crean's skull, he failed. "I grabbed for the axe," Mackay said, and with this repeatedly lashed out with it at his head. That made the priest, who'd been sitting to ward off the blows, lie back in the bathtub. Mackay says that then he went out of his mind and just kept attacking. "It was something in me that just exploded." He bludgeoned Crean on the face and head and watched the man's skull crack open. Then, as Crean lay helpless and alive, Mackay put in the plug and turned on the water, sitting on the edge to watch his victim struggle helplessly, unable to control his body movements. Time passed. It took Crean nearly an hour to finally realize he was going to die. He touched his skull, feeling his exposed brain, which Mackay found highly erotic. Then Father Crean expired. Mackay watched the body for another quarter of an hour, completely fascinated with it, and then returned to his mother's to eat the dinner she had made him. Late that night, one of the nuns discovered Father Crean's blood-covered corpse and called the police. They had a good idea about who might have done it. Mackay was quickly arrested at the home of a friend. Thanks to a tip, the police tracked him down and got him talking. He confessed in under half an hour. The same officer who had arrested him 2 years earlier for robbing Father Crean nabbed him again. Around the same time, someone else matched a fingerprint from one of the area robberies to Mackay. With all of this against him, he went to Brixton Prison to be held for trial. At first, he admitted to 3 murders: the 2 elderly women and the priest. He was appointed a solicitor, Robin Clark, who believed he had a good case for the insanity defense. Mackay certainly had a long record of mental imbalance. But when Mackay told inmates of other murders he'd committed, this information got back to the detectives, who once again began interrogating him. Others with unsolved killings on the books came as well. In all, Mackay confessed to having taken the lives of 11 people for 2 years. The list included a woman stabbed in the throat on a train, 3 elderly women bludgeoned in their homes, a woman with her grandson stabbed in their apartment, a man thrown into the river, and a man bludgeoned in his shop as he closed up for the night. But Mackay recanted the confessions and was never convicted. In prison, he was subjected to psychiatric assessment. Several opinions were offered on his state of mind when he committed the crimes with which he'd been charged. Most of them agreed that Mackay was a psychopath. He had a personality disorder, not a mental illness. He knew what he was doing. He knew that it was wrong, and he felt no remorse. When Robin Clark asked Dr. James Stewart to testify to Mackay's diminished capacity, he would not do so. He believed that Mackay had a blunted moral sensibility, and the state of medicine at the time, similar to what it is today, indicated that there was no known treatment for psychopathy. It was challenging to know what to do with him. Judged sane by psychiatrists and fit to plead, Mackay was brought to the Old Bailey to have his case settled. He was charged with 3 of the murders, along with related charges, on November 21, 1975. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter with diminished responsibility. He said that admittance to a hospital for long-term treatment was his last hope to survive as a human being. To avoid an expensive and pointless trial, the prosecution accepted the plea. The judge pronounced sentence. He called Mackay a highly dangerous man and sentenced him to life in prison. He sent Mackay to Wormwood Scrubs. In retrospect, Mackay viewed his own life as having been wasted and now destined to rot. He wished that he'd ended it at one of the many points in time when he'd had the impulse to do so. The newspaper headlines made the most of the story. "The man who enjoyed killing," said one. Another had "bloodlust of the beast in black," while another foreshadowed the inevitable controversy to follow with "Life for the mad killer, law let go." Mackay was passed from one place to another. Each time he got into trouble, he received the same sentence: probation. In other words, he was given along in the hope that, somewhere along the line, he'd wise up, get better, or grow out of it. It seemed that those in a position to do something about it wouldn't, and those who wanted to help couldn't. He wasn't going to grow out of it. He was only going to get worse, and those in a position to know about juvenile violence ought to have seen his frightening potential and made more of an effort. But this case is long over. The point now is to use it to study others and understand what can hinder psychopathic violence, which comes from learning from the killers themselves. In Lustmord, King includes some entries from Mackay's prison journals, dated 1975, as he awaited his trial. Mackay discussed how his father would get violently drunk and aggressive, and always when he was like this, he beat me with the back of his hand and sometimes his fist. Harry would not admit to having a problem with alcohol, but in retrospect, Mackay believes that he did. While Mackay's father never seemed to beat his sisters, Mackay's mother was assaulted as frequently as he was. "It was plain bloody regular," he wrote. In October, a month before his final hearing and sentencing, Mackay admitted to feeling remorse. As he pondered what he had done during his killing spree, he said that he could not think what motivated him to do all these foul deeds. "I find it all a confusing matter." He admitted that he frightened even himself, yet he blamed others, including his home life and the psychiatrists. That's typical of a psychopath: blame others and shed personal responsibility. "Poor me," is the general sentiment. He even faulted the prevailing attitudes of the 1960s that allowed the system to manipulate children without fathers. He also wrote about the possibility that he was misdiagnosed as a psychopath without mania when he believed that he did indeed have an obsession. Someone, he thought, was not paying attention. He figured that he was in the better position to judge his own mind than his doctors were, and, of course, he wanted to be incarcerated in a psychiatric hospital rather than a prison. Also, Mackay blamed an imperfect world for his actions. He said that when he was released from Moss Side in 1972, he had the best intentions. He couldn't have foreseen then how difficult it would be to adjust. "These murders were so solemn," he recalled, "yet so quick, so fast to take place." He claimed that he could not remember much, and some of the details he'd been told he simply couldn't affirm or dispute. He recalled making the corpse of one female victim, Isabella Griffiths, comfortable as she lay face up in her kitchen, and he'd covered her. Mackay also expressed his hope that someone reading his journals would get some good from his experience. "I shan't shed a tear," Mackay had written in his journal. "Life is full of shocks of all descriptions, and they have to be faced. I am just one example of many bad ones, but who can say totally so? It's one thing to know the details of cases involving multiple murder, and it's another to distill from them the prognostic red flags. This is clear. We do not yet know what particular behaviors predict that someone will become a repeat killer. We can only say that some actions are associated with these incidents more than others. They can be linked to a collection of factors that appear to be statistically significant in risk assessment studies. Many repeat killers behaved in ways that, in retrospect, indicated that one day they might act out. An inability to deal with stress, for example, and angry outbursts or retaliation against others. The unrelenting buildup of frustration derives from the way they learned, or did not learn, to manage anger and stress. In essence, that's related to how their observations of role models interact with their personal cognitive processing. Those who experience higher exposure to violence in the environment appear to have a greater tendency to duplicate it. Among developmental factors associated with violence are harmful substances ingested by mothers during pregnancy, chronic maternal stress during pregnancy, early maternal rejection or abuse, nutritional deficiencies, a low verbal IQ, and chronic trouble with attention deficit and hyperactivity. While no factor clearly causes it, in certain combinations and with certain dispositions, they can provoke anger, thwart the development of anger management skills, and trigger impulsive violence against self or others. If kids fail to connect early with caregivers, there can be problems later in life. Self-worth, resilience, intelligence, and empathy are essential to building character for sufficient conflict resolution. Without these skills, children cannot establish rewarding relationships with community systems. Among the specific traits or behaviors that signal concern, which we can see in the Mackay case, are his preoccupation with themes of violence, his low frustration tolerance, stressors on his family unit since childhood, the way he collected perceived injustices and blamed others for his issues, his ability to dehumanize others, his poor coping skills, his sense of superiority, his substance abuse, and his mental instability. Those psychologists or psychiatrists who did issue warnings clearly spotted these signals, but others with more power over the decision-making process perhaps weighted other factors more heavily. In any event, Mackay may have been stopped somewhere along the way before 3 or more people were murdered. A system that allows this to happen needs to police itself and make an improvement plan.
Imagine that you could earn nearly $1 million for every year you spent in prison, with the understanding that you would likely get out in the prime of your life. Would you take that deal? More specifically, suppose you could live like royalty behind bars, in almost total control, with guests free to come and go as they pleased. Cell phones, TV, gourmet food, and fine wine to eat and drink. Would that make the deal worth 20 years of your life? For serial murderer Charles Sobhraj, the idea of retiring to Paris and making $15 million for a movie deal based on his life made spending more than 2 decades in a notoriously corrupt Indian prison worthwhile. Sobhraj, a Vietnamese Indian by birth and French national by adoption, turned a sentence for homicide in India into almost a life of leisure, while at the same time evading prosecution for a dozen murders in jurisdictions that should have brought a death sentence. He was a con man, jewel thief, drug dealer, and murderer, but one who lived a life of adventure and intrigue that made him a media celebrity. He amassed enough money to bribe his captors, who provided him with amenities to make life in an Indian prison more bearable. For most of his incarceration, he had access to typewriters, a television, refrigerator, and large library. That's in addition to the drugs and food that he used to entertain and control his fellow inmates in the prison that was supposed to be the harshest in India. Even more vexing was the idea that, at 52 years old, Sobhraj could walk out of Delhi's Tihar prison, sign a $15 million deal for his life story, and then charge the media upwards of $5,000 an interview once he returned to Paris. Not bad for a man who was convicted of 1 homicide and accused of committing at least 10 more. Some authorities believe Sobhraj killed more than 20 unsuspecting European and American tourists and pilgrims who journeyed to the Far East and the subcontinent. Some came east in search of drugs, and others came in search of spiritual growth. Instead, they found Charles Sobhraj and his gang of killers. Sobhraj wanted to create a family-like cult of sorts with himself as the father figure, says Dutch diplomat Herman Nippenberg, who spent years trying to bring Sobhraj to justice. Nippenberg said Sobhraj wanted to create his own family of Charles Manson-like characters with himself as the father. The ones he killed were the people who saw through his mask and tried to get away. Today, you may be able to find Charles Sobhraj idling away his days in a Paris bistro, and for a fee, he may even sit down and talk about his life. He has slipped easily into the life of a celebrity, with mainstream publications willing to pay for posed pictures of the murderer enjoying the good life. In the words of his agent, no money, no meeting. The friends and relatives of his victims only hope that karma, the concept that says the collective force of a man's actions dictates his destiny, isn't done yet with Charles Sobhraj. Early childhood abuse, injury to the brain, usually the frontal lobes, and extremely indifferent or cruel parenting are often found in the backgrounds of serial killers. But what made Charles Sobhraj evolve into a psychopath? Could the constant travel back and forth between his natural parents and the ensuing rejection be enough to drive a man to serial homicide? Recent scientific research into the minds of psychopaths provides a different theory. Until the psychopath came into focus, it was possible to believe that bad people were just good people with bad parents or childhood trauma, and that, with care, you could talk them back into being good, writes journalist Robert Herx. Noted criminologist Bob Hare's research suggested that some people behaved badly even when there had been no early trauma. A professor at the University of British Columbia, Hare has spent years studying psychopaths to try to address what has turned out to be a common malady. Through decades of research, interviewing, and conducting experiments on some of society's most notorious criminals, Hare developed a commonly used measurement scale to determine a subject's level of psychopathy. What he has learned is troubling. Hundreds of thousands of psychopaths live and work and prey among us. Your boss, your boyfriend, your mother could be what Hare calls a subclinical psychopath, someone who leaves a path of destruction and pain without a single pang of conscience, Herx writes. Even more worrisome is the fact that, at this stage, no one, not even Bob Hare, is quite sure what to do about it. Hare's research helps explain the behavior of men like Charles Sobhraj. Unlike many serial killers, Sobhraj killed for economic and personal gain. He only wanted the passports and identity papers of his victims. That made it easier for his jewel and drug smuggling operations. Sobhraj wasn't driven to kill by perverse sexual desire, nor did he get any particular satisfaction out of homicide. The people he murdered were merely in the way. They had something that Sobhraj wanted, and so he took it. If I have ever killed, or have ordered killings, then it was purely for reasons of business, just a job, like a general in the army, Sobhraj told journalist Richard Neville during his trial in India. Psychopaths like Sobhraj are incapable of feeling remorse. To them, the phrases, "I want to kill you," and "I want to kiss you" carry the same emotional punch. The concept of fear is almost unknown to them, so the threat of punishment will never be a deterrent. Within the psychopath, diagnosis is a subdivision of behavior that analysts call the puppet master. This class is made up of men like Charles Sobhraj, although killers like Charles make up only a small portion of the puppet masters out there. The puppet master would manipulate somebody to get at someone else. This type is more powerful because they're hidden, Hare said. Industrial psychologist Paul Babiak attributes a trio of motivations to psychopaths: thrill-seeking, an almost insatiable desire to win, and the propensity to injure others. They'll jump on any opportunity that allows them to do these things, he says. If something better comes along, they'll drop you and move on. In one of Charles Sobhraj's earliest encounters with crime, he once explained to his mother that he could always find an idiot to do what I wanted. The comment came when 10-year-old Charles was accused of inducing a stepbrother to rob a shopkeeper. Hare talks about how imprisoned psychopaths learn the words but not the music that parole boards and society want to hear. They can repeat all the psychiatric jargon, I feel remorse. They talk about the offense cycle, but these are words, hollow words. The constants in Charles Sobhraj's formative years were abandonment and second-class status. Born Gurmukh Sobhraj to an unwed Vietnamese woman, Sobhraj grew up feeling his parents' indifference to his existence. His mother, Song, was abandoned by the Indian tailor soon after her first son was born, and she blamed him for her lover's dismissal. His father wanted little to do with Gurmukh, but the youngster twisted it around in his head to believe that his father was a mythic, heroic figure. Eventually, Song met up with a French officer stationed in French Indochina, and they were wed. The soldier, Lieutenant Alphonse Dureau, was willing to adopt Song's son, but not to give the boy his name. Dureau was kind to Sobhraj, but as other children were born to Dureau and Song, Gurmukh began to feel more and more an outsider in his own home. For his part, Dureau, who had suffered shell shock during a battle and for the rest of his life was in and out of hospitals for post-traumatic stress disorder, looked at Sobhraj as a drain on scarce family resources. A child shunned in such a way will eventually do things to gain attention. For neglected children, even negative attention is considered better than no attention at all, and Charles, he took the name as a teenager after being baptized a Catholic, was no different. From an early age, he was disobedient and delinquent. He was a smart, charismatic youngster, but his grades suffered and he was often absent from school. When he did show up, Charles was a discipline problem for his schoolmasters. Living in Marseille, Charles had access to ships heading east to Indochina, and he began stowing away on them in an effort to reach his natural father. The affection Charles held for his father was not returned, however. Several times the boy managed to make it out of Marseille only to be discovered while at sea and returned to port, at no small cost to his mother or father, depending on who could be convinced to pay the boy's fare. Charles bounced back and forth between the Orient and Europe, at home in neither place. The geographic cure his parents hoped for never occurred because wherever Charles went, he took his psychopathic personality. He was uncontrollable, and as he reached his late teens, his family became unwilling to bail him out of trouble. When he was arrested for burglary in Paris and sentenced to 3 years behind bars, he went to prison, estranged from his family. Alone, without anyone who cared whether he lived or died, Sobhraj was determined to make his family and all society pay for throwing him away. Some consider this need for vengeance a pretense. His claims that his life was a protest against the French legal system or that his love for Vietnam and Asia motivated his criminal career are absurd. But as tools of psychological manipulation, they were very effective, Neville wrote. The year 1963 would be the first of many behind bars for Sobhraj, and he quickly adjusted to life in prison. It was brutal and cruel, and a small half-Asian teen like Charles should have been fresh meat for predators in jail. However, Charles knew karate and he used it to defend himself. Poissy Prison near Paris was a terrible place. It was built in the 16th century as a convent and converted into a prison by the agnostics of the French Revolution. High stone walls separated prisoners from the outside world, and the individual cells were so small they were used only for sleeping. During the day, the prisoners were lumped together in pens, sorted into groups based on their ferocity, sanity, and nationality. It is a horror, Sobhraj biographer Thomas Thompson quotes a visitor as saying, "One enters the place and chills pass through the bones like stepping into a cellar. Each moment I am inside, I am repelled." Sobhraj's behavior in jail was indicative of things to come. Prisoners were forbidden to keep books in their cells, but not Charles. Infractions that would have brought harsh punishments were not enforced around Sobhraj, and he portrayed himself as so pathetic he attracted the special attention of one of the volunteers who visited prisoners. The man, Felix Descogne, was a wealthy young man who came to Poissy each week to help prisoners with letters, resolving simple legal issues, and providing companionship. Charles quickly latched on to Felix, whom he treated as a savior and role model. The men struck up a friendship during the time Charles was imprisoned, and Felix even tried to reconcile father and son, as well as Charles with his mother, with limited success. He provided Charles with reading material, emotional stability, and encouragement as the young man idled away his days in Boise. After he was paroled, he moved in with his friend Felix and resumed his criminal lifestyle, but he was much more adept and cautious. He straddled two very different worlds. In one, the bright world of Felix Desgagne was filled with work and service, and interaction with some of the best Parisian families. The other world was the darker, more sinister place where Charles Sobhraj felt at home, the Parisian underworld. Charles's own self-destructive behavior sent him back to jail on the very night he proposed to his fiancée. He had stolen a car and taken the woman, Chantal, to a glamorous casino. Crazed, almost frenzied wagering caused him to lose thousands of borrowed francs, for which he blamed Chantal, who had put off his requests to marry him. Later, with Chantal white with fear beside him, he sped home at breakneck speed until Chantal agreed to be his bride. It was at that time he noticed Le Flics in the patrol car behind them, siren wailing and lights flashing. He tried to evade the police but lost control on a rain-soaked curve and crashed the car. He was arrested and sent back to Boise for 8 months for evading police in a stolen car. At the time of his sentencing, Felix wrote a warning to the judge, advising that mandatory psychological counseling be part of any sentence. He explained his request by listing some of Sobhraj's behaviors. He exploits 100% the weaknesses of those around him, Thompson reports that Felix wrote the judge. He has a small conscience, if any, is capable of politeness, but calculatedly so. Impulsive and aggressive. Chantal was a beautiful young Parisian woman living at home with her parents when she met Charles Sobhraj at a party. Instantly, she was taken with the erudite, well-heeled young man who told her of his adventures in the Orient and Dakar and his fictitious wealthy family back in Saigon. He spoke like a poet and courted young Chantal, despite her parents' initial disapproval of their daughter's new beau. There was no way her father, a traditional French Catholic, would allow his daughter to marry a Vietnamese half-breed, no matter how rich he said his family in Vietnam was. But Chantal was smitten, and when Sobhraj was sent back to prison for an additional 8 months, she stood by him, pledging chastity and telling her friends and coworkers that her boyfriend had been called up by the military. Constitutionally unable to see fault with himself, Charles blamed the world for his latest run-in with the law. He did his time quietly, but in a series of letters to Felix, he denied responsibility for his actions. By the time he was released 8 months later, Sobhraj had built up a rather nice nest egg through a series of scams. The money made Chantal's parents a little more amenable to their daughter marrying Charles, and they were wed in a simple civil ceremony attended by representatives of both families. Shortly afterward, Chantal revealed she was pregnant. At the same time, Charles decided to leave Europe and head to the Orient before the life of scams and cons he was living caught up with him. He was passing bad checks all over France, and it was only a matter of time before the police realized that the common link to a rash of burglaries in wealthy homes was that Charles Sobhraj had recently been on the premises. Asking Felix, who had re-entered his life, if he could borrow a car for a day or two, Charles loaded his worldly possessions and his pregnant wife and left France. The couple worked their way across Eastern Europe, passing bad paper, robbing people who befriended them, and leaving a trail of crimes and victims in their wake. By the time they reached Istanbul in Felix's stolen MG, authorities had been visiting their friends in Paris, looking for the couple. In Bombay, Chantal gave birth to a baby girl. Charles and Chantal integrated into expatriate French society on the subcontinent. Charles, the highly personable and intelligent psychopath, was quickly accepted by some of the highest-ranking French citizens in India, and Chantal, an attractive and personable young woman with an adorable baby, was just as welcome at the women's teas and parties. This early in their marriage, Chantal was still blissfully unaware of her husband's thieving ways. He would talk to her about his business, and on more than one occasion she would act as an unwitting accomplice to his schemes, but for a stretch of several months, he operated successfully without police interference. During much of 1970, Sobhraj operated a stolen car brokerage operation, obtaining hard-to-find American and European autos for homesick Frenchmen and wealthy Indians with a passion for Western cars. Charles would either steal the cars or fence stolen cars in Pakistan or Iran, then bring them over the border to India, greasing the palms of greedy Indian border guards who were willing to overlook the lack of import paperwork. He would gain legitimate title to the vehicles by turning them in as stolen and buying them back at auction. Then he would sell them to grateful friends at great profit. His business put him on the road much of 1970 and 1971, leaving a lonely and homesick Chantal in Bombay, often wondering where Charles had gone. To appease her, he brought her back beautiful jewelry from God knows where. Charles's only weakness seemed to be compulsive gambling, and this disease would result in his second serious run-in with the law and ultimately his downfall. Charles lost lots of money at the Mackay casino, prompting a liquidation of the jewels he gave to Chantal. Pawning the jewelry was insufficient to pay his gambling debts, literally putting his life at risk from casino collectors who are much more ruthless than their American and European counterparts. Luckily, Charles was introduced to a Frenchman who had a plan to obtain enough money for Charles to pay off his debts, but also to live quite comfortably for some time. The jewel store robbery was doomed from the start. Breaking into a hotel room above the store in the Swank Hotel Ashoka in Delhi, India, Charles and his crew intended to drill through the hotel floor and drop down into the store during the night. But after 3 days of drilling with little progress, it was clear the plan would fail. The criminals then lured the owner of the store, blissfully unaware of the drilling going on above his head, up to the room on the premise of meeting a rich client. Sobhraj obtained the keys to the store at gunpoint and proceeded to empty the cases. Fleeing to the Delhi airport with a bag full of stolen gems, Charles was forced to abandon his loot at customs when the store owner escaped his bonds and notified police, who sealed off the airport. Charles left $10,000 in cash and even more in jewels as he returned empty-handed to Bombay. Bombay was too appealing to a thief like Charles. Besides, Chantal and the baby were still there, so he again took up his car theft scam. Shortly after returning to Bombay, he was pulled over by police in a stolen vehicle, and based on eyewitness identification, he was arrested for the attempted jewel robbery at the hotel. He was taken to Bombay's prison, Tihar, and from there he staged the first of his dramatic prison escapes. Pretending to have a bleeding ulcer, Charles was taken to a local hospital where he was diagnosed as having appendicitis, even though there was nothing wrong with him. Recovering from needless surgery, Charles convinced Chantal to help him escape from the hospital by drugging his guard. Chantal crawled under the covers in Charles's bed and took a dose of chloroform herself to allay suspicions that she had conspired to help her husband escape. He was recaptured shortly after, and both Chantal, whose unconsciousness had failed to convince the police of her innocence, and Charles were taken into custody. Chantal was released shortly after on bail. Eventually, Charles was able to post bail with money borrowed from his father in Saigon, and they fled India. In Kabul, Afghanistan, Charles supported his wife and child by running cons and robbing hippies who had come east following the hashish trail from Europe. The Sobhrajs lived comfortably in Kabul, but soon wanderlust struck Charles, and he took his family to the airport. He had neglected, however, to pay the hotel for 2 months of rent and was arrested by Afghan police. Again, he plotted an escape. In Afghan prisons, inmates are responsible for obtaining their own food by employing runners, often young beggars. If an inmate has no money, he starves. Charles had his runner purchase a syringe with which he drew his own blood and drank it, making it look like he had an ulcer. Taken to the hospital, he managed to drug his guard once again and flee to Iran. For the next year, he flew around the Eastern Hemisphere in a scattered manner, never settling anywhere long enough to arouse the suspicions of the police, although he continued to support himself by theft. He often traveled with as many as 10 passports, some bought, some stolen, and none with the name Charles Sobhraj. Charles no longer used his given name. Instead, he changed identity at the drop of a hat, depending on the passport he held. He would later tell police that during 1972 to 1973, he traveled to Karachi, Pakistan, Rome, Tehran, Kabul, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and as far north as Copenhagen. Abandoning his family in Kabul, Charles saw his marriage end. The loyal Chantal, now with a dossier of her own in the massive Interpol database, had had enough of her criminal husband and left for France. Once there, she prayed she would never see Charles Sobhraj again. By the time Chantal fled to Paris, the places Charles Sobhraj could travel were quickly becoming limited. He was joined in Istanbul by his younger brother Andrei, the same person he had called an idiot willing to do his bidding as a 10-year-old, who became an active participant in Charles's scams. Andrei pledged obedience to his older brother when Charles told him he could never return to France because of his criminal record, but the younger man suggested they find other countries in Europe to plunder. Looking east, Charles told Andrei he saw a world where he could blend into the crowd. His Indian-Vietnamese heritage allowed him to portray any nationality he wanted, and where police were more accommodating if the price was right. Rejecting Andrei's suggestion that they return to Europe, Charles decided to return to the Orient. Ultimately, Andrei would pay dearly for his foolish desire to follow his brother. They pulled a couple of minor heists in Turkey, then fled to Greece when things got too hot, and robbed a few tourists in Athens before they were arrested following a minor jewel robbery. Charles banked on the hope that the Greeks and Turks, historic enemies, would never share information about the two brothers who preyed on tourists. Charles convinced Andrei that it would be easy to make authorities think Charles was Andrei and Andrei Charles. Sobhraj was a wanted man, and if he pretended to be Andrei, whose crimes were minor in the eyes of Greek justice, he could walk out of prison in a few weeks. Later, when he was safe across the frontier, Andrei could tell the Greeks that he was the real Andrei Darreau and that they had released the wrong man. They would then let him free. The plan nearly worked, but when the Greeks decided to throw the book at the two men, Charles was forced to fall back on another plan. Once again feigning illness, he managed to escape the police van taking him from a hospital to prison, and he disappeared. In a few days, Andrei went to the warden and revealed that they had let Charles Sobhraj, not Andrei Darreau, escape. Sadly for him, the angry Greeks opted to turn Andrei over to their Turkish enemies, who were not prepared to be lenient. After a trial, Andrei was convicted of theft and sentenced to 18 years of hard labor. With his brother languishing in a Turkish prison, Charles fled eastward. He flitted around India, Kashmir, Iran, and the Near East, operating small-time scams and frauds. His typical modus operandi was to find a French or English-speaking tourist couple, befriend them and impress them as a mysterious, wealthy deal-maker, and either use them as jewel couriers or steal their bankrolls, passports, and travel tickets. As he was perfecting this scheme, he met the woman who would become his closest confidant and accomplice. She was Marie Leclerc, and she had come to the East looking for adventure. She found it with Charles Sobhraj. Charles met Marie, a French-Canadian, while she was sightseeing, and managed to convince her to return to Bangkok after her vacation ended. When Marie returned to the Orient with a satchel full of love letters Charles had written her during their months apart, she was shocked to find that he had linked up with a Thai woman named May, whom he had described as his secretary. Marie's love for Charles was pathological. She was unable to see any evil in him and was even willing to put up with his dalliances. Years later, as she languished in Tihar prison awaiting trial, she wrote to Charles, who had found a new lover. "Ruong is 12 years younger than I and fresher. You need a woman who can live under any conditions, any climate. As for me, I'm old, tired, rarely dynamic or smiling, with a bitter character that can't adapt due to my advanced age. Ruong must remain with you. The important thing is that you don't find yourself alone, that you have someone who loves you." Undoubtedly, Sobhraj believed there was enough of him to share between two women. Somehow, Charles convinced Marie to become his partner in crime, and they met up with an Australian professor and his wife who were vacationing in Thailand. Inserting himself into their lives, Charles skillfully won over the Australians, who thought they had discovered a real friend. Charles and Marie served the Aussies coconut milk laced with powerful sedatives. When the couple was asleep, Charles ransacked their hotel room, stealing several $1,000s in cash, as well as their passports, wedding rings, and plane tickets. Just as another man named Charles had done half a world away a few years before at the Spahn Ranch in California, Sobhraj began building a family of sorts, with himself as the head. As May floated around the periphery, Charles and Marie took in a wandering French boy named Dominique. Over a period of days, Charles subtly administered enough poison to make Dominique ill with what appeared to be dysentery. Charles graciously offered the use of his home while the boy recovered. Normally, dysentery resolves itself quickly or kills its host through dehydration, but Dominique had a hard time recovering. In reality, Sobhraj was keeping Dominique off balance to make him dependent. Once it was made clear that Dominique was in Charles's debt, and the boy accepted his position, his recovery accelerated. As the youth grew healthy, Charles added 2 more young men, Yannick and Jacques, former police officers in the French colonies. Rather than poison them, he wooed them with wine and song, and while they were enjoying a night out on the town with Marie, Charles slipped away and stole their passports and savings. "Do not worry," he assured the 2 frantic young men. They could stay with him while new passports were procured in Bangkok. Any remuneration would be worked out later. The final addition to Charles's circle was a young Indian named Ajay Chowdhury. As cold as Charles, Ajay quickly became his lieutenant and accompanied him everywhere. Ajay was a confidant, accomplice, and co-conspirator for Charles, who could be counted on to come through in even the most delicate circumstances. After assembling his coterie, Charles Sobhraj began to kill. There were rumors that he had killed before, but for the first time, Charles began leaving a trail. His first victim was an American pilgrim named Jenny Bolivar, who had come east to find herself through meditation and immersion into a Buddhist lifestyle. Instead, she made the mistake of falling in with Charles and his crowd for a few days. Why Charles murdered Jenny isn't clear, but the Dutch diplomat Herman Nippenberg believes Sobhraj killed her after she refused to join his entourage and become a smuggler. Jenny was found dead in a tide pool in the warm waters of the Gulf of Thailand, wearing a simple flowered bikini. At first, it appeared the beautiful young woman had drowned after a night of hashish and beer. But months later, when an autopsy was performed, the forensic evidence made it clear someone had held her head underwater until she drowned. The next victim was a young nomadic Sephardic Jew, Vitaly Hakim, who, like Jenny, had come east looking for life's meaning, but instead fell into Charles's trap and found death. He accompanied Ajay and Charles on a trip to a nearby resort town on the Gulf of Thailand and, according to Charles, opted to stay with friends he had met there. Yannick and Jacques were puzzled by this because Vitaly had left his clothes in a closet in the apartment and had turned over his passport and traveler's checks to Charles for safekeeping. Several days later, a horribly burned body was found on the road to Pattaya, the resort destination of Charles, Vitaly, and Ajay. The male body showed signs of having been beaten, but it was clear to police that the poor man had been alive when he was doused with gasoline and set ablaze. Police assumed the man had been set upon by Thai bandits and slain. They did not connect his murder with the death of Jenny Bolivar. In December 1975, Vitaly Hakim's friend came east looking for him. His hotel noted that Hakim had checked out several weeks earlier and never returned. Vitaly had left a message for his girlfriend, however, and unwittingly drew another victim into Charles's murderous web. Charmaine Carew, a French citizen, turned up dead in circumstances almost identical to Jenny's death. Apparently, she traced Vitaly's whereabouts to Charles Sobhraj and started asking too many questions. Months later, when an autopsy was performed, officials discovered that Charmaine had been strangled, not drowned, and that she had been suffocated with such force that bones in her neck shattered. 2 couples were Charles's next victims. Although they were separated by time and space, they would share the same horrible fate at the hands of the man who had become known to the police as the Serpent. Henk Bentanja and his fiancée, Cornelia Kaki Hemker, were Dutch students traveling around Southeast Asia when they met Charles Sobhraj in Hong Kong. He introduced himself as Alain Dupuy, a gem dealer, and quickly ingratiated himself with the two frugal Dutch. As a special favor, Charles sold Cocky a sapphire ring for $1,600 and invited them to his luxurious villa in Bangkok. He had to leave before them, but he said he would send a car and driver to meet them at the airport. Hink and Cocky quickly met the same fate as so many others, mysteriously falling ill, and began recuperating at Charles's apartment. Charles took special care of the Dutch couple, locking up their valuables in his safe, along with their passports. The night Charmaine Carew appeared in Charles's apartment, Hink and Cocky were quickly hustled out of the building despite their illness. No one questioned Charles and Ajay when they returned a short time later smelling of gasoline and covered in dirt. Charles offered no explanation, but Dominique and the two former flicks were becoming suspicious. The Bangkok papers trumpeted the news about two tourists who had been bushwhacked by bandits and murdered. The man and woman had been strangled before their bodies were set ablaze. No identification had been found. The papers speculated about how the two doomed lovers met their fate for a few days until the discovery of a second drowned Western woman pushed the story off the front page. Entering Nepal using Hink's passport, he met a pair of wandering Westerners in Kathmandu. Laddie Dupar and Annabella Tremont met in Nepal and quickly became friends. Laddie had come from Canada to climb Mount Everest, and Annabella was a restless California girl looking for meaning in her life. They spent a good deal of time in the section of Kathmandu called Freak Street, where anyone could buy anything from hashish to rubies. Laddie was biding his time until the weather cleared and Everest was climbable, and Annabella was just biding her time. Details are sketchy about how they met Charles Sobhraj in Kathmandu, but it wasn't long before a man's body was found in a field, burned and slashed with a knife. While authorities were trying to identify the body, a second Westerner's body, positively identified as Annabella, was found nearby. She had been stabbed several times in the chest. Police got their first lead when Nepalese customs reported that Laddie Dupar had left the country very shortly after the estimated time of Annabella's death. They surmised that Laddie had killed his new girlfriend and fled the country as soon as possible. They were confused, though, about the identity of the Western male who had been found nearby. Of course, it was not Laddie Dupar who fled Nepal after killing Annabella. Charles used Laddie's passport to fly home to Bangkok, where he sold some jewels Laddie had purchased in Delhi. Then, using the passport of Hink Bintanja, he returned to Kathmandu the next day. Police managed to trace the last few days of Laddie and Annabella, and when they caught up with Charles, Marie, and Ajay, the trio managed to bluff their way through questioning. While he was in Bangkok, Charles had made a startling discovery. Dominique, Yannick, and Jacques had put the pieces together and realized they had been under the care of a homicidal maniac. They broke into Charles's office and found dozens of passports and identity papers belonging to unfortunate tourists who had met up with Sobhraj. The three Frenchmen fled Sobhraj's apartment and Thailand, heading home to Paris. Before they left, they told police what was going on in the apartment building. On the run from Nepalese authorities, Charles and company crossed the border into India and made their way to Calcutta. They fit well in what is perhaps the most poverty-stricken place on the planet. Charles had no money, knew he was wanted by Nepalese police, and could only guess what was waiting for him back in Bangkok. But he believed he was superhuman and that no mere mortal could bring him down. Charles had a plan. All he needed was a clean passport and some money. He found both in the person of Israeli scholar Avani Jacob, who died in a run-down Calcutta hotel room where he had been drugged and strangled. Jacob's passport and traveler's checks, about $300 in total, were missing. Using Jacob's passport, Charles led Ajay and Marie to Singapore. The three were so down on their luck that Marie was forced to use the passport of a Frenchman they had rolled. Charles assured Marie that no Indian border guard would know enough to question why she had been given a man's name, and he was right. Charles was always right. And so, he returned to Bangkok, where he promptly drugged and robbed a rich American, stealing his identity. Although Avani Jacob's papers were still usable, Charles had learned that it never hurt to have a spare passport. For some reason, luck was on his side, because the police, armed with the information from Yannick and friends, quickly brought the trio in for questioning for the Bikini Murders. It was a laughable, half-hearted investigation. The Thais were not interested in ruining their tourist trade by having a highly publicized trial. The Dutch embassy, led by Herman Nippenberg, was adamant about having a full-scale investigation. Nippenberg was particularly driven to prosecute Sobhraj, or Alain Gauthier, or Robert Grenier, or whoever this man pretended to be. The diplomat was convinced the man police had questioned was responsible for the deaths of at least 2 Dutch tourists. It was not to be. Years before, Charles had told his brother that the Far East was the land of greased palms, where anything could be bought if the price was right. He proved it in early 1976 when he paid $18,000 to have a Thai police official look the other way while he and his cohorts fled the country. They stopped briefly in Malaysia, where Charles sent Ajay to the mining towns to procure some gems. Ajay returned with several hundred carats of jewels worth about $40,000. Charles intended to sell the jewels in Geneva to raise capital, but first he had to take care of one loose end. No one knows exactly what happened to Ajay Chowdhury in Malaysia, but when Charles met Marie at the airport to catch their flight to Geneva, Ajay was not with him. She inquired as to his whereabouts, but the look in Charles's eyes told her never to ask that question again. To this day, authorities believe Ajay Chowdhury, the partner in crime to so many of Charles's murderers, had outlived his usefulness and lies buried somewhere in the steaming Malaysian jungle. He overestimated his own intelligence and underestimated law enforcement agencies in the Far East, believing it did not matter that Thai police were looking for Alain Gaultier or even Laddie Dupar. He had outsmarted them before, and he would again. But when news of a serial killer in Thailand who was killing tourists emerged in the spring of 1976, the Thais knew they had to find Charles Sobhraj. Tourism is important to Thailand, and no 300,000 baht bribe could compete with the millions that would be lost if the people were afraid to come. So far, 2 American women, 2 Canadians, a Turk, 2 Dutch citizens, a French woman, and an Israeli scholar had died in Southeast Asia under mysterious and similar circumstances. Calls for justice came from nearly every embassy. Charles Sobhraj came to the attention of Interpol first in 1973, when he was linked with the aborted jewel robbery in the Hotel Ashaka. He was not linked to the bikini killings in Thailand by Interpol. They were looking for Alain Gaultier. But nonetheless, Interpol's massive database contained quite a detailed dossier on Charles. Sooner or later, every criminal slips up, and even the most intelligent sociopath like Charles Sobhraj makes mistakes. When he did, Interpol was there to see it, and the long arm of the law was there to make sure he did not escape again. In Bombay, Charles and Marie began working on their scam again. Charles rebuilt his family by bringing in 2 lost Western women and made a quick score by drugging a Frenchman named Jean-Luc Solomon. Jean-Luc succumbed to the poison he had been given and died without regaining consciousness, turning a simple robbery into murder. Charles, Marie, Mary Ellen, and Barbara traveled to Delhi, where Charles wanted to run a scam. He quickly latched onto a tour group of French postgraduate students and became their unofficial guide around the city. The students considered themselves lucky to have found a fellow Frenchman in such a strange place, and when he offered them a pill that he said would ward off dysentery, many took it with gratitude. His plan was to wait until the students had become drowsy from his drug and then rob their rooms, but Charles's reach exceeded his grasp. The pills worked too quickly, and all around him in the lobby of the hotel, students were dropping like flies. When someone realized that the only people who were ill were those who took their new friend's medicine, a trio of burly students wrestled Charles to the ground and sent for the police. It was the beginning of the end for Charles Sobhraj. Classic police work quickly rounded up the rest of Charles Sobhraj's crew, and Barbara and Mary Ellen were the first to crack. They told everything they knew. Charles held out during 2 weeks of intense questioning without changing his story that he was a French merchant and an important one at that. but even he grew tired in the face of mounting evidence that was coming in from all corners of the globe. The Thais had a warrant, good for 20 years, out for Charles and the murders there. Nepal was interested in speaking with him about some killings there. He had escaped from a Greek jail and an Afghan prison, and the Turks had imprisoned his brother for a crime they both committed. The French wanted nothing to do with him, as he had been exiled many years before. The Indians charged him with murder for killing Jean-Luc Solomon. The accused were taken to Tihar prison outside Delhi. For Marie and the two women, the deepest circle of hell would have been better than Tihar prison. Classified as murderers awaiting trial, their food consisted of bread and water with whatever else they could buy. The water came out of a standpipe in their cells once a day, and if they weren't ready for it, they could wait for tomorrow's ration. Rats and insects knew no fear in Tihar prison, as the convicts were usually too weak to put up much of a fight, so rodents ran brazenly through the bars of the cells. As for toilet facilities, these consisted of a hole in the corner of the cell. Marie's cellmate was a young Malaysian girl who had been arrested and then forgotten, and who was slowly going insane. But Charles wasn't bothered in the least. He knew how things worked in India and concealed in his body more than 70 carats of precious gems. While his new home wasn't as comfortable as his apartment in Bangkok, it would do until he decided it was time to move on. Charles had no fear of being left to rot in Tihar. He knew eventually he could buy his way out. Times were tough in India during the mid-1970s. Indira Gandhi ruled with an iron fist through martial law, and conditions were harsh. The judicial system was clogged with political prisoners and criminals alike. As a result, nearly 2 years passed from the time that Charles Sobhraj and his clan were arrested before he and Marie went on trial. In the intervening months, Mary Ellen and Barbara had each tried to kill themselves out of despair. Charles, of course, was fine. Charles Sobhraj's trial is worthy of a story in itself. It featured the return of André Darroux, who, having been granted an early parole by the Turks, unbelievably traveled to India at Charles's request to help him escape. There was a mid-trial appeal to the Indian Supreme Court and a witness, Mary Ellen, recanting her statement of seeing Charles drug Jean-Luc. Sobhraj hired and fired lawyers at will, and toward the end of the trial, went on a hunger strike to protest the inhumane conditions at Tihar. He ended up defending himself. The judge, however, was unimpressed with the theatrics and found Charles guilty of administering drugs with intent to rob, causing hurt to commit robbery, and the Indian equivalent to manslaughter, culpable homicide not amounting to murder. Marie was found not guilty, but was returned to Tihar to await trial in the poisoning of the French graduate students. She would eventually serve some time for that crime and be released on mercy parole when she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. She died at home in Canada, professing her love for the man who had ruined her life. Charles faced the death penalty, and the prosecution argued strenuously for just that. It was well known that he had killed many besides Jean-Luc Solomon, and that he undoubtedly would kill again. But Charles argued that time served in Tihar prison was punishment enough. Did Charles manage to buy off the judge? That isn't known, but is certainly a possibility. Around the world, law enforcement officials were astounded when the judge sentenced Charles Sobhraj to 7 years in prison. The Serpent had emerged victorious once again. Charles was also convicted in connection with the abortive attempt to rob the French tourists, and that 5-year sentence added to his 7-year term. The sentence, while obviously better than death, presented a problem for Sobhraj. The warrant from Thailand was good for 20 years, which meant that as soon as he was done serving his hitch in Tihar, he would be deported and very likely executed. 12 years would be enough time for witnesses to disappear or prosecutors to lose interest. But escape from Tihar, an easy feat for a man like the Serpent, meant he would be an international criminal and a wanted man. He needed a plan and had a few years to come up with a good one. Biding his time, Charles literally ran Tihar. He wanted for almost nothing and counted both guards and prisoners as his friends. In fact, as he was finishing his 10th year behind bars, he threw a party for his friends. This time, it didn't matter when the sleeping pills took effect, and in the middle of his party, as cons and guards alike passed out from the drugs, Charles Sobhraj walked out of the jail. He later said it wasn't his plan to flee the subcontinent. He just wasn't ready to leave Tihar yet and wanted to stay a few more years. So he arranged to be caught and was sentenced for the drug assault and escape. His gamble paid off. Over time, authorities around the world forgot about Charles Sobhraj, and the case against him in Bangkok eventually withered away as witnesses died or evidence was lost. On February 17, 1997, the Serpent walked out of Tihar prison. He was in the prime of his life, 52 years old. There was little chance that Thai officials could make a case against him so many years later, but Charles was a man without a country. He was to be deported from India, so he was kept in custody until authorities found a country that would take him. In March 2002, an Indian film company announced that it was making a film about his life. The project is not exactly a Sobhraj biography because we have taken some creative liberties and because it's not an exact biography of his life, the assistant director told Nihar Online, an Indian web-based newspaper. The film will in no way glorify a killer. It is instead a question of man, morality, and redemption. The idea of redemption remains questionable. Several years into his incarceration in India, Charles was interviewed by an Australian writer, vowing never to repeat his past mistakes. He stopped short of saying he would never kill again. I have already taken from the past what is best for me, what helps me live in the present and prepare for the future, he told Richard Neville. If I play back a murder, it will be to see what I have learned from the method. I won't even notice the body. In late 2007, news media reported that Sobhraj's lawyer had appealed to the then French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, for intervention with Nepal. In 2008, Sobhraj announced his engagement to a Nepali woman, Nahida Biswas, who later participated in the reality show Big Boss. On July 7, 2008, issuing a press release through his fiancée Nahida, he claimed that he was never convicted of murder by any court and asked the media not to refer to him as a serial killer. It was claimed that Sobhraj married his fiancée on October 9, 2008, in jail on Bara Dashami, a Nepalese festival. On the following day, Nepalese jail authorities dismissed the claim of his marriage. They said that Nahida and her family had been allowed to conduct a tikka ceremony along with the relatives of hundreds of other prisoners. They further claimed that it was not a wedding but part of the ongoing Dashain festival, when elders put the vermilion mark on the foreheads of those younger than them to signify their blessings. In July 2010, the Supreme Court of Nepal postponed the verdict on an appeal filed by Sobhraj against a district court's verdict sentencing him to life imprisonment for the murder of American backpacker Connie Jo Bronzich in 1975. Sobhraj had appealed against the district court's verdict in 2006, calling it unfair and accusing the judges of racism while handing out the sentence. On July 30, 2010, the Supreme Court upheld the verdict issued by the district court in Kathmandu of a life sentence for the murder of Connie Jo Bronzich and another year, plus a 2,000 rupee fine for using a fake passport to travel. The seizure of all Sobhraj's properties was also ordered by the court. Sobhraj's mother-in-law/lawyer, Shakuntala Thapa, expressed dissatisfaction with the verdict, with Thapa claiming that Sobhraj had been denied justice and the judiciary is corrupt. They were charged and sent to judicial custody for contempt of court because of these remarks. Sobhraj has another case pending against him in the Bhaktapur District Court for the murder of Canadian tourist Laurent Carrère. On September 18, 2014, he was convicted of another murder. As of 2018, Sobhraj is in critical condition and has been operated on multiple times. Many questions have been asked on the basis of the bias any of his surgeons may face. He has received several open-heart surgeries and is scheduled for more.
On Monday morning, March 6, 1944, foul smoke poured from the chimney of a stylish home at 21 Rue Le Sueur, Paris. Neighbors suspiciously eyed the three-story 19th-century house with its private stable and courtyard, once the home of a lesser French princess. As the hours, then days, dragged on with no abatement of the noxious smoke, a neighbor finally went to complain on Saturday, March the 11th. He found a note tacked to the door. Away for 1 month. Forward mail to 18 Rue des Lambardes in Auxerre. Police were summoned, and a pair of officers arrived on bicycles. Neighbors informed them that the house owner, Dr. Marcel Petiot, maintained a separate residence 2 miles away at 66 Rue Caumartin. Some noted the mysterious parade of callers at Dr. Petiot's empty house during the past 6 months, including nightly visits from a stranger with a horse cart. Some months earlier, 2 trucks had stopped at number 21, the first removing 47 suitcases, while the second delivered 30 or 40 heavy sacks of something unknown. The officers telephoned Dr. Petiot at home. He asked whether they had entered the house, and upon receiving a negative reply, he cautioned, "Don't do anything. I will be there in 15 minutes." A half-hour later, with the smoke worsening and no sign of Petiot, the patrolman called for firefighters. Entering through a second-story window, firemen searched the upper floors before entering the basement. They soon emerged, one vomiting, their chief telling the cops, "You have some work ahead of you." 3 officers next went downstairs, where a coal-fed stove was found burning full blast, a human arm dangling from its open door. Nearby, a heap of coal was mixed with human bones and fragments of several dismembered bodies. It was impossible to count the victims in this tableau of grisly disarray. Stunned, police left the basement at about the time Dr. Petiot arrived on his bicycle. "This is serious," Petiot remarked. "My head could be at stake." Then, after questioning each lawman to ascertain that they were French, Petiot identified the basement dead as Germans and traitors to our country. Petiot claimed to be the head of a resistance group with 300 files at home on Rue Caumartin, which must be destroyed before the enemy finds them. The French policeman, embittered by years of Nazi occupation, allowed Petiot to leave. 7 months would pass before they saw him again. Meanwhile, a search of the death scene proceeded. In Petiot's garage, police found a large heap of quicklime mixed with human remains, including a recognizable scalp and jawbone. A pit had been dug in the stable, filled with more quicklime and corpses in various stages of decomposition. On the staircase leading from the courtyard to the basement, police found a canvas sack containing the headless left half of a corpse, complete but for its foot and vital organs. Commissaire Georges-Victor Massu, a 33-year-old police veteran with more than 3,200 arrests to his credit, immediately took charge of the case. Examining the death house, he noted basement sinks large enough for draining corpses of blood and a soundproof octagonal chamber with wall-mounted shackles, a peephole centered in its door. Massu was still on the scene at 1:30 a.m. when a telegram arrived from Paris police headquarters. It read, "Order from German authorities. Arrest Petiot, dangerous lunatic." To French patriots, that order from German invaders suggested Petiot might indeed be a hero of the resistance. Police dragged their feet on the way to Rue Caumartin and found Petiot's apartment abandoned, no trace of the doctor or his family. Rather than search for him, detectives grilled the workmen who had remodeled the house on Rue Le Sueur. When Parisian authorities learned that Petiot had been jailed and tortured by the Gestapo from May 1943 until January 1944, it eliminated the rationale for an urgent manhunt. Back at Rue Le Sueur, searchers collected mutilated remnants of at least 10 victims. However, Chief Coroner Albert Paul told reporters that the number 10 is vastly inferior to the real one. In addition to identifiable bones and body parts, Dr. Paul catalogued 33 pounds of charred bones, 24 pounds of unburned fragments, 11 pounds of human hair, including more than 10 whole scalps, and 3 garbage cans full of pieces too small to identify. Based on the substantial pieces, Paul said the oldest victim was a 50-year-old man, the youngest a 25-year-old woman. None bore any knife or gunshot wounds, nor had they been poisoned with any toxic metal. Organic poisons could not be ruled out from the samples in hand. At Petiot's apartment on Rue Caumartin, police found quantities of chloroform, digitalis, strychnine, and other poisons, plus 50 times a typical physician stock of heroin and morphine. Clearly, there was something odd about Dr. Petiot, but he was gone. Patriot or villain, he had slipped away, leaving police with 3 questions. Who were the victims of 21 Rue Le Sueur? How did they die? And where was Dr. Petiot? A police review of Petiot's background helped identify 2 victims from the 21 Rue Le Sueur slaughterhouse. One was Jean-Marc Van Beve, a Paris drug addict who procured his narcotics from Dr. Petiot until February 1942, when Van Beve was jailed in a crackdown on pharmacies trading in illicit drugs. Van Beve admitted buying fraudulent prescriptions from Petiot, but he vanished days before his March 1942 trial. At the time, police believed underworld associates likely murdered Van Beve, but they reconsidered that judgment 2 years later in light of their discoveries on Rue Le Sueur. Another victim was identified as Martha Caet, the mother of another addict, one Raymond Baudet, who also bargained with Petiot for her poison of choice. Baudet had been jailed in March 1942, 2 weeks before Van Beve disappeared, and Petiot had come to Martha Caet with an idea to help himself get off the hook. He suggested that Mrs. Caet could lie under oath, claiming that some of Raymond's prescriptions, written in her mother's surname, really belonged to Martha, thereby weakening the prosecution's case against Petiot. Caet agreed, then had a change of heart after consulting her physician. She vanished on March 26th. Later, her husband received 2 letters declaring Martha's intention to leave the country. The husband consulted Petiot, who confirmed Martha's plan to escape Nazi-occupied France. Unconvinced, Raymond Baudet reported her mother missing on May 7, 1942, but no trace of Martha was found until officers searched 21 Rue Le Sueur. In July 1942, Petiot was convicted in both narcotics cases. He was fined 10,000 francs for each offense, but the fine was reduced on appeal to a total of 2,400 francs. Inspector Roger Ginoux suspected Petiot of murdering Caet and Van Beve, but he had no proof that either victim was dead until March 1944. By that time, Petiot had disappeared. The search for Petiot began in earnest on March 13, 1944. His wife and son were questioned in Paris, along with his brother Maurice. Maurice Petiot, lacking his brother's gall or cunning, soon confessed that he had delivered the quicklime to 21 Rue Le Sueur, acting on Marcel's orders. Charged with conspiracy to commit murder, Maurice was jailed on March 17th. Georgette Petiot was also detained, suspected of aiding husband Marcel in his crimes. German commissaire Robert Judcombe provided the motive for Petiot's murders, along with details of Petiot's 8-month imprisonment by the Gestapo. Petiot had been arrested in May 1943, along with 3 others, on suspicion of smuggling Jews out of occupied France. Casting their net for witnesses, police found a Paris resident who planned to flee but changed his mind. Marcel Petiot, he said, had offered passage to South America with all required travel papers for 25,000 francs. One who used Petiot's service and vanished forever was Wahim Gushinov, a Jewish furrier. When he disappeared in January 1942, Gushinov took some 500,000 francs in cash, 5 sable coats, plus gold, silver, and diamonds worth as much as 700,000 francs. Once the escape network was exposed, the police had no difficulty capturing Petiot's accomplices. A childhood friend of Petiot's, René Gustave Nézondet, was arrested on March 17, 1944. A friend of Nézondet's, picked up the same day, Roland Porchon, admitted referring clients to Nézondet and Petiot. In July 1942, Porchon told detectives that Nézondet described Petiot as the king of criminals, claiming that he had seen 16 corpses stretched out in the basement of 21 Rue Le Sueur. A second witness recalled Nézondet's admission that he had helped Petiot hide bodies. Nézondet, for his part, initially denied the charges, then confessed on March 22nd. He had a different chronology for the story, though, claiming that he first learned of the slaughter on Rue Le Sueur in November or December 1943, when Petiot was in Gestapo custody. Besides the corpses, he had also seen a diary, now missing, which listed the names of 50 or 60 victims. 6 others were arrested in the Petiot manhunt, including a barber who referred clients to Petiot from his shop on Rue des Mathurins, and Albert and Simone Neuhausen, who were held for receiving stolen property after they confessed that they helped remove suitcases from 21 Rue Le Sueur. Most of the suspects were released in April 1944, though Nezonde remained in custody for 14 months. Marcel Petiot was still a fugitive on June 6, 1944, when Allied troops invaded France and the investigation ground to a halt. Marcel André Henri Félix Petiot was born in Auxerre, 100 miles south of Paris, on January 17, 1897. Neighbors later told many stories of his bizarre childhood, but it is unclear how many were fabricated for the press. He enjoyed torturing small animals to death, they said. His early teachers found Petiot intelligent, reading like a 10-year-old by age 5, but he was also a loner with a short attention span. Precociously lewd, he once propositioned a male classmate for sex and was caught passing obscene photos to other students. At age 11, he stole his father's revolver and fired it in history class. He also staged a circus act at school, standing a friend against a door and throwing knives at him. Of course, Petiot's parents were concerned. Between 1907 and 1909, they told physicians that Marcel was prone to convulsions and sleepwalking and habitually wet his trousers and bed. Petiot's mother died in 1912, and his father took a job in Joigny, 15 miles from Auxerre. Marcel and Maurice lived with an aunt until Marcel was expelled from school near year's end. Sent to stay with his father, Petiot was soon expelled from a Joigny school for unruly behavior and overexcitation. Petiot soon graduated from childhood mischief to criminal behavior. At age 17, he robbed a postbox and was then charged with mail theft and damaging public property. The court recommended a psychological evaluation. On March 26, 1914, a psychiatrist pronounced Petiot an abnormal youth suffering from personal and hereditary problems which limit to a large degree his responsibility for his acts. It was enough to get the charges dropped in August, Petiot's judge declaring that the accused appears to be mentally ill. A pattern was forming. Petiot was expelled twice more from schools in Dijon and Auxerre, before finally completing his education in Paris at a special academy in July 1915. World War I was in progress, and Petiot was drafted into the French infantry in January 1916, dispatched to the front that November. While fighting in the Aisne district 6 months later, Petiot was gassed and wounded by grenade fragments. The wounds healed, but Petiot displayed mental illness symptoms that sent him to a series of clinics and rest homes. Charged with stealing army blankets, he was jailed at Orléans, then transferred to a psychiatric ward at Fleury-les-Aubrais. Doctors diagnosed Petiot as suffering from mental disequilibrium, neurasthenia, mental depression, melancholia, obsessions, and phobias. Once again, they ruled him not guilty by reason of insanity. The diagnosis did not keep him out of military service, however. Returned to the front in June 1918, Petiot promptly suffered a nervous breakdown and shot himself in the foot. Transferred behind the lines, he displayed convulsions at the Dijon railway depot in July, lying unconscious for most of the day. That episode earned him a 3-week leave, but he was attached to a new regiment in September 1918. Erratic behavior and complaints of headaches sent him back for psychiatric treatment at Rennes in March 1919. This time, the diagnoses added were amnesia, sleepwalking, depression, and suicidal tendencies. It was finally enough to get him out of uniform. He was discharged with a 40% disability pension in July. Petiot's case was reviewed in September 1920, with his disability rating increased to 100%. The author of that report suggested that Petiot be committed to an asylum. In fact, Petiot had already entered a mental hospital, but not as a patient. Aided by an accelerated education program for war veterans, he had completed medical school in a stunning 8 months and served a 2-year psychiatric internship at Évreux. He received his medical degree on December 15, 1921, from the Faculté de Médecine de Paris. Criminal insanity notwithstanding, Petiot had become a full-fledged physician. Armed with his new medical degree, Petiot moved to Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, an ancient village on the Yonne River, 25 miles from Auxerre. On arrival, the 25-year-old physician printed flyers comparing himself to the town's two elderly doctors. The flyers read, "Dr. Petiot is young, and only a young doctor can keep up to date on the latest methods born of progress, which marches with giant strides. This is why intelligent patients have confidence in him. Dr. Petiot treats but does not exploit his patients." In fact, while outwardly charming and popular with most of his patients, Petiot secretly enrolled them for state medical assistance, thereby ensuring that he was paid twice for each treatment, once by the patient and once by the government. He favored addictive narcotics in his prescriptions. When one pharmacist complained of the near-fatal dose Petiot prescribed for a child, Petiot replied, "What difference does it make to you anyways? Isn't it better to do away with this kid who's not doing anything in the world but pestering its mother?" In private, Petiot remained a loner who turned casual conversations into heated debates, ever insisting on the last word. He lived modestly, but splurged on a sports car he drove recklessly through Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, causing numerous traffic accidents. A confirmed thief, Petiot stole from strangers and relatives alike. Brother Maurice insisted on searching his pockets every time Marcel visited his home. Evicted by one landlord for theft of furniture and fixtures, Petiot shrugged off threats of litigation with the remark that, as a certified lunatic, he could never be convicted. Around the same time, in March 1922, Petiot clashed with the Commission de Réforme over demands for new psychiatric exams to maintain his disability payments. He declared that he purely and simply refused to accept any disability pension at all to avoid being subjected to what I find a more than disagreeable bit of exhibitionism. Still, the checks kept coming, and he was examined once more in July 1923. Doctors reporting that his tongue was scarred from bite wounds during epileptic seizures and that Petiot evinced total indifference about his future. That said, his disability was reduced to 50%. In 1926, Petiot surprised his neighbors by launching a torrid affair with young Louise Devallot, the daughter of Madame Fleury, an elderly patient. Soon after the affair began, the Fleury home was burglarized and set afire. No one connected the events, but Petiot was suspected when Louise disappeared in May 1926. Neighbors recalled seeing Petiot load a large trunk into his car, closely resembling another fished out of the river weeks later, filled with the dismembered, decomposing remains of a young woman who was never identified. Ignoring the coincidence, police searched briefly for Louise and then dismissed her as a runaway. She may, in fact, have been Petiot's first murder victim. Soon after Louise disappeared, Petiot ran for mayor of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne. The long, bitter campaign climaxed in July 1926 when Petiot hired an accomplice to disrupt a political debate with his opponent. When Petiot finished speaking, his crony cut power to the auditorium, blacking out the entire village and starting several fires. Petiot won by a landslide. His opponent later told the Commission de Réforme that Petiot had boasted of feigning insanity to escape military service. Yet another review of his case confirmed the original diagnosis, pronouncing Petiot's claims of fraud another manifestation of the subject's mentally unbalanced state. Villeneuve-sur-Yonne now had a certified madman in charge, and Petiot acted the part. His kleptomania was an open secret. Mayor Petiot was suspected of stealing money from the town's treasury, the bass drum from a local band, even a large stone cross that Petiot had once deemed an eyesore. Some despised Petiot. Others called him the best mayor ever. Petiot, for his part, blamed all criticism on crass political enemies. In June 1927, Petiot married Georgette Lablé, the 23-year-old daughter of a wealthy landowner in nearby Seignelay. Their only child, a son Gerhardt, was born the following April. 8 months after that happy event, Petiot was accused of stealing several oil cans from Villeneuve-sur-Yonne's railroad depot. As it turned out, Petiot had purchased the oil legally, but he did commit fraud by denying receipt of the shipment and claiming a refund. In early 1930, The court at Sens fined him 200 francs and sentenced him to 3 months in prison. Petiot was suspended as mayor for 4 months, but managed to have the conviction reversed on appeal. In the meantime, more serious trouble was afoot. One night in March 1930, fire razed the home of dairy unionist Armand Debove. His wife, Henriette, was found inside, beaten to death with a blunt instrument. Police suspected murder during a robbery, since 20,000 francs was reported missing from the house. Footprints led across the nearby field towards Villeneuve-sur-Yonne. Rumors spread that Henriette Debove was Dr. Petiot's mistress and that he was seen near her home on the night of the crime. In that case, the witness, a Monsieur Fisco, declared his plans to testify but made a fateful visit to Dr. Petiot's office instead. Fisco sought treatment for his rheumatism. He received an injection and died 3 hours later, Petiot signing the death certificate, blaming his demise on an aneurysm. In April, Armand Debove spoke to police, telling them that a resident of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne had claimed Dr. Petiot could identify Henriette's killer. Local gendarmes sought help from police headquarters in Paris, but the file was somehow misplaced, disappearing until April 1946. By that time, Dr. Petiot was charged with multiple murders in Paris, and no one seemed interested in reopening the Debove investigation. During the next 16 months, the local prefect logged numerous complaints against Mayor Petiot, most involving theft or financial irregularities. Prosecutors investigated, finding that 138 alien registration applications and 2,890 francs in fees had been held at City Hall, never relayed to the proper authorities. Petiot blamed his secretary, who obliged the mayor by accepting responsibility. But Petiot was still suspended as mayor for the second time in August 1931, and he resigned the next day. The village council also resigned in sympathy, leaving files in disarray and many purchase orders obviously altered. Petiot's mayoral office was officially revoked the next month, but he did not seem to mind. 5 weeks later, on October 18th, he won the election as the youngest of 34 general councillors from the Yonne district. As usual, his tenure was stormy, with Petiot accused of stealing electric power from the village of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne in August 1932. At trial on that charge the following year, the judge dubbed Petiot's defense pure fantasy and sentenced him to 15 days in jail and a 300-franc fine. The appeal dragged on for a year, affirming Petiot's conviction but suspending the jail time, with his fine reduced to 100 francs. The conviction cost Petiot his council seat, but it hardly mattered since he moved his family to Paris in January 1933. Petiot promoted himself with typical zeal in Paris, offering patients a wide variety of treatments, claiming both real and imaginary credentials. Advertisements described him as an intern at one mental hospital where he had actually been an interné, or a patient. Outside his home office at 66 Rue Caumartin, Petiot erected a brass plaque so jam-packed with phony endorsements that another physician complained to the medical association and Petiot was forced to remove it. Bogus credentials aside, Dr. Petiot attracted a vast clientele and built an exemplary reputation. Years later, at the height of his infamy in 1944, police would interview 2,000 patients without hearing a word of criticism about Dr. Petiot. At the same time, however, rumors persisted that Petiot was an abortionist, which was illegal in those days, and that he supplied addicts with drugs under the guise of cures. In 1934, 30-year-old Raymonde Hans visited Petiot for treatment of an abscess in her mouth. She was still unconscious when Petiot drove her home after surgery. Hans never regained consciousness and died several hours later. Her mother, Madame Anna Coquille, demanded an autopsy, which revealed significant levels of morphine in Raymonde's body. The coroner postponed burial until a full investigation was completed, but authorities closed the case without filing charges. Madame Coquille renewed her complaints in 1942, but the court upheld its original finding of death by natural causes. Petiot faced his first investigation for narcotics violations in 1935, but police found no conclusive evidence. The next year, Petiot was appointed médecin d'état civil for Paris's 9th arrondissement, which granted him authority to sign death certificates. As usual, he used the position for personal gain. In December 1942, summoned to pronounce the death of a wealthy lawyer, Petiot was accused of stealing 74,000 francs from the dead man's home. Caught shoplifting a book in April 1936, Petiot assaulted a policeman and escaped on foot. He surrendered 2 days later, tearfully pleading for mercy, citing his military discharge records as proof that he was not responsible for his behavior. Police dropped the assault charge, and Petiot was acquitted of theft on grounds of insanity. His wife, Georgette, arranged for Petiot to enter a private sanatorium in August 1936. Petiot had barely arrived at the hospital when he began pleading for immediate release. His madness had passed, he assured staff psychiatrists. It was a momentary aberration caused by his preoccupation with a new invention, a suction machine designed to relieve constipation. Dr. Rogue de Felsac found Petiot chronically unbalanced, but still recommended his release in early September 1936. Petiot's liberation was nonetheless stalled while the court appointed 3 more psychiatrists to review his case. The panel's report expressed strong doubts as to Petiot's good faith at any point during this affair, but the doctors could find no legal grounds for holding him. Petiot was released in February 1937. Chastened by his latest confinement, Petiot appeared to clean up his act, with the exception of persistent tax fraud. Between 1937 and 1940, he reported less than 10% of his actual income. In 1938, for instance, he declared 13,100 francs, while earning closer to 500,000 francs. That year saw him charged with fraud and fined 35,000 francs, despite a spirited defense that included pleas of poverty. Every Frenchman's life changed in September 1939, when German troops invaded Poland, thus launching World War II. Polish resistance collapsed in October, inaugurating the 7-month phony war between France and Germany. Fighting spread with the Nazi invasion of Denmark and Norway in April. German troops invaded Holland, Belgium, and France the following month. The French commander of Paris declared it an open city in June 1940, and German troops seized the French capital. A collaborationist French government under Marshal Philippe Pétain was organized 2 weeks later in Vichy, broadcasting orders for a general ceasefire. 42,000 French soldiers surrendered on June 22nd, while the resistance armed and organized for long years of guerrilla war. In Paris, Dr. Petiot had a new world of opportunity under German occupation. He would use and emulate the Nazis in pursuit of his greatest and most lethal scheme thus far. There was, it seems, at least some truth to Petiot's later claims of joining the resistance. Soon after the Nazi occupation of Paris, he began providing false medical certificates to Frenchmen drafted for slave labor. Petiot also apparently treated sick and wounded workers returned to France from Germany, gleaning information about Nazi troop movements and weapons development. His Fly Talks network, named after a popular insecticide, since informers were dubbed flies, spied on Gestapo headquarters in Paris to identify collaborators so teams of resistance assassins could eliminate them. At the same time, though, Petiot spun tales of patriotic battles that were never fought. He claimed to have invented secret weapons that killed Nazis without forensic evidence. Allied commanders denied his reports of high-level meetings, and no evidence of the mysterious weapon ever surfaced. Petiot also claimed to be working with a group of anti-fascist Spaniards in Paris, but they were never found. His tales of planting bombs and booby traps around Paris were fervid flights of fantasy. Petiot's chief operation after 1940 was disclosing escape routes to potential fugitives. He welcomed Jews, resistance fighters, petty criminals, anyone who could meet his price of 25,000 francs a head. For that amount, Petiot promised safe passage to South America, complete with all the necessary travel papers. In 1941, he bought the house at 21 Rue Le Sueur as a way station for his personal underground railroad. Among Petiot's early customers were 2 Parisian pimps, Joseph Réaucreux and Adrien Estebetegui. who had lately broadened their repertoire to include armed robbery while disguised as Gestapo agents. Sought by French and German police alike, Riocreux sought help from Petiot, known as Dr. Eugène to his illicit clients, in September 1942. Traveling with his mistress, Claudia Chamoux, and another couple, pimp François Albertini and prostitute Annette Basset, Riocreux paid his fee and promptly vanished into 21 Rue Le Sueur. Estebetegui and girlfriend Gisèle Rosny followed in March 1943, also vanishing without a trace. Petiot would later boast of killing the 3 pimps and their women, branding all 6 as Nazi collaborators, touting their executions as his patriotic duty. By April 1943, Gestapo officers reported a great deal of talk in public about an organization which alleges clandestine crossings of the Spanish border using falsified Argentinian passports. Nazis asserted that the voyagers travel on neutral ships leaving from a port in Portugal. In fact, they never left Paris alive. Gestapo agent Robert Julcum blackmailed a French Jew, Yvon Dreyfus, into approaching the network for passage, but Dreyfus vanished with the rest in May 1943. Others who availed themselves of Dr. Petiot's services included Nelly Denise Autain, a pregnant newlywed who came looking for an abortion in July 1941 and was never seen again. Dr. Paul-Léon Bromberger, an elderly Jew who planned to flee with his wife, disappeared alone from a Paris subway station in June 1942. A month later, 3 German Jews, the Knellers, vanished after consultations with Petiot. Their dismembered remains were fished out of the Seine in August. 3 more refugees, the Wolf family, disappeared into 21 Rue Le Sueur along with 6 friends. Another pimp, Joseph Pierrechy, also made the dead-end journey with his mistress, Josephine Aimée Grippé. Those were the victims whom police later identified, but they did not comprise the total body count. Numerous dismembered victims were dragged from the Seine in 1942 and 1943, the remains including 9 heads, 4 thighs, and sundry other mutilated pieces. French police and coroners were baffled, unable to identify most of the dead. Gestapo agents, for their part, were less concerned about dead Frenchmen than about the prospect of Jews and resistance fighters escaping to freedom. The Nazis had a fix on Petiot's Fly Talks network, and by May 1943, they were ready to spring the trap. Petiot advertised his illicit services so blatantly that the Fly Talks network was ripe for infiltration by early 1943. In fact, an informer named Charles Beretta had wormed his way into the operation, feeding names to the Gestapo as he went. In May, Nazis arrested Raoul Fourier, Edmond Pintard, and René Gustave Nézondet, torturing them until they identified Marcel Petiot as Dr. Eugène. Petiot joined the others in prisons at Fresnes. Although Nazis searched his home and other property, they somehow missed the charnel house on Rue Le Sueur. Nézondet was released 2 weeks later, but Petiot, Fourier, and Pintard spent a total of 8 months in prison. They were tortured repeatedly, but staunchly refused to betray members of the resistance. Based on the tales Petiot spun at his murder trial in 1946, his stubborn silence may have sprung from simple ignorance. The hero had no names to offer his captors since he played no significant role in the resistance movement, and any confession of his Fly Talks operation was tantamount to suicide. Frustrated, the Nazis released Fourier, Pintard, and Petiot in early January 1944. Ironically, the months of torture and confinement provided Petiot with his best cover yet, but his time was running out. By March, his chamber of horrors on Rue Le Sueur was exposed, and Petiot himself had vanished. Loyal patients and friends were the key to Petiot's survival as a fugitive. They shuttled him from one address to another in Paris, while he cultivated a beard and adopted one name after another to conceal his movements. Eventually, Petiot found a home with patient Georges Redouté. Petiot convinced Redouté that the Gestapo wanted him for killing Germans and informers. While living with Redouté, Petiot ventured out only at night, sometimes returning with weapons claimed to have been captured from Nazi patrols. Parisian police went on strike in August 1944, besieged at their préfecture by German tanks and troops. That month, Petiot, calling himself Henri Valéry, joined the new French Forces of the Interior, the FFI. He was promptly commissioned as a captain in charge of counter-espionage and interrogation of prisoners in Paris's Reuilly district. The French capital was liberated the next month and collaborators were purged, with Petiot Valéry in the thick of the action. His cover began to unravel in September when 2 FFI soldiers from Petiot's unit robbed the elderly mayor of Tessancourt, stealing 12.5 million francs in cash and collectible stamps from his home before killing their victim in front of witnesses. 3 youths reported the crime to Petiot, who promptly tossed them in jail. An FFI lieutenant tried to investigate but was ordered off the case by Captain Valéry. The bandits were briefly detained, then released. The thieves disappeared, as well as the money. 3 days after the robbery murder, the newspaper Résistance published a scathing article on fugitive Petiot. The story called him a soldier of the Reich who had allegedly donned a German uniform to hunt down Avignon's French patriots in March 1943. Attorney René Fleuriot, Petiot's defense counsel in the 1942 narcotics cases, received a letter from his fugitive client which condemned the Résistance article as a collection of filthy kraut lies. While the letter was false, Petiot's letter convinced the authorities that he was still in Paris. A new search began, with FFI Captain Henri Valéry among the officers drafted to hunt for Petiot. Petiot's luck ran out at 10:15 a.m. on October 31st, when Petiot was recognized and arrested at a Paris metro station. He carried a pistol, 31,700 francs in cash, and 50 documents in 6 different names. Petiot's long run was over, but the search for the truth had just begun. Petiot's defense was a plea of complete innocence. He admitted killing certain enemies of France as a resistance member, but denied any murders for profit. According to Petiot, he first became aware of corpses stashed at 21 Rue Le Sueur in February 1944 after his release from Nazi custody. He assumed the dead collaborators had been killed and dumped by members of his Flytalks network, long since scattered and unable to verify his story. Petiot had asked brother Maurice for quicklime to dissolve the bodies and camouflage their odor. Petiot was housed on death row at Santé prison while authorities investigated his claims. Strangely, for a patriotic hero, he had no defenders in the leadership of recognized resistance groups. Some knew him as a small-time hanger-on, a fraud, or not at all. Other groups, described in detail by Petiot, proved to be non-existent. No record survived of his alleged bombing forays, the assassination of Nazis, or tests of his various secret weapons. Prosecutors finally dismissed Petiot's story and charged him with murdering 27 victims for plunder, an estimated 200 million francs in cash, gold, and jewels that were never recovered. Petiot's trial began on March 18, 1946, at the Palais de Justice, before a panel of 3 judges and a 7-man jury. René Fleuriot once again defended Petiot. Prosecutors were helped by 12 civil lawyers who were hired by the relatives of Petiot's victims. Petiot took an active role in his own defense, bantering with judges and prosecutors, grilling witnesses, exchanging jibes with the private attorneys. He denounced the Cait family's lawyer as a double agent and a defender of Jews, while noting that victim Joseph Réaucreux was easy to spot as a collaborator. He had a head like a pimp, like a police inspector. Victim Joachim Gushinov was alive and well, Petiot insisted. Why couldn't prosecutors find him? Because, Petiot smirked, South America is a big place. And so it went. Petiot refused to describe his secret weapons because the information could only be used against France. He dismissed the Wolf family, Dutch Jews fleeing Nazi persecution at home, as Germans, while victim Yvon Dreyfus was a traitor 4 times over. Victim Kurt Neller suffered from an embarrassing affliction, which Petiot refused to name, but he and his family had not been killed. They had returned to Germany, Petiot insisted, and were getting ready for the next war. Petiot had met Dr. Paul-Léon Bromberger for 10 minutes in my life, at a public luncheon. He could not explain why Bromberger's clothing was found at 21 Rue Le Sueur. Many fugitives had survived the Flytox escape route, Petiot testified, but none were identifiable because they changed names frequently. Rebuked by the Chief Judge Michel Lessay for doodling in court, Petiot retorted, "I am listening, but it doesn't interest me very much." After the trial's second day, reporters overheard two jurors and Judge Lessay discussing Petiot in private, referring to him as a demon and an appalling murderer. Attorney Fleuriot immediately sought a mistrial, but the appellate court rejected the motion. The trial resumed after the two offending jurors were replaced. On the trial's fifth day, judges and jurors visited 21 Rue Le Sueur. As he passed through a phalanx of police and jeering neighbors, Petiot quipped, "Peculiar homecoming, don't you think?" Petiot maintained his hero's posture to the end, admitting that he had killed 19 of the 27 victims found on Rue Le Sueur. They were all Germans and collaborators, of course, ranked among the 63 enemies of France whom Petiot admitted killing between 1940 and 1945. The other 44 were not identified, with Petiot telling the court, "I don't have to justify myself for murders I'm not accused of committing." He had already said more than enough. René Fleuriot's summation, hailing Petiot as a hero of the resistance, won a standing ovation from the courtroom audience. But the judges and jurors held a very different view. After deliberating for 3 hours, a mere 90 seconds for each of the 135 criminal charges, the court convicted Petiot on all but 9 counts. He was acquitted of killing Nelly Denise Autain, but found guilty of 26 other premeditated murders. Although it did not seem to faze him in the slightest, Petiot's death sentence was a foregone conclusion. Attorney Fleuriot appealed the conviction and sentence, citing 2 complaints. First, he maintained that a mistrial should have been granted after Judge Lessay and 2 jurors publicly declared their belief in Petiot's guilt. Furthermore, Fleuriot charged, witness Marguerite Bromberger and her maid were perjurers. They lied in maintaining that Dr. Bromberger was dead instead of hiding out in South America. All 3 points were rejected, and Petiot's death sentence was affirmed. The day before that judgment was rendered, guards found an ampoule concealed in Petiot's prison uniform. They suspected it was cyanide, but the contents proved to be a sedative, smuggled into prison when Petiot arrived the previous October. The prisoner seemed calm, smiling as he asked his guards, "When are they going to assassinate me?" He refused to see a priest, preferring, as he said, to take his baggage with him. Petiot had been scheduled to die on the day his appeal was rejected, but the guillotine malfunctioned that morning and his execution was postponed. At 3:30 a.m., May 25th, a portable guillotine was delivered to the prison, assembled and ready to do its grim work less than an hour later. Summoned from his cell, Petiot refused the traditional glass of rum, but accepted a cigarette. He also agreed to meet with the prison chaplain for his wife's sake, telling the minister, "I am not a religious man, and my conscience is clean." The closing ritual was swiftly completed. Petiot signed the register before his hands were bound, his neck shaved, and the collar cut from his shirt. He approached the guillotine calmly. Among the witnesses, Dr. Albert Paul noted that Petiot moved with ease, as though he were walking into his office for a routine appointment. Before he was strapped into the guillotine's sliding table, Petiot warned the observers, "Gentlemen, I ask you not to look. This will not be very pretty." The blade dropped at 5:05 a.m. According to the witnesses, Petiot was smiling as his head tumbled into the basket. New York State Troopers Sean Ruane and Deborah Spargaran were patrolling Long Island's Southern State Parkway at 3:15 a.m. on June 28, 1993, when they spotted a Mazda pickup truck with no rear license plate. When flashing red lights failed to stop the driver, they used the loudspeaker, ordering the driver to halt. But he accelerated, speeding down the next off-ramp into the streets of Wantagh. The wild chase was on. Ruane and Spargaran looked for backup as they pursued their quarry at nearly 90 miles an hour. 5 more patrol cars joined the convoy, sirens wailing, before the Mazda's driver missed a turn in Mineola and crashed his truck into a telephone pole at 3:36 a.m. He offered no resistance as police removed him from the pickup, frisked him for weapons, and removed an X-Acto knife from his pocket. The driver's license identified him as 34-year-old Joel David Rifkin, residing on Garden Street in East Meadow, Long Island. He was generally unkempt, and a thick layer of Noxzema was smeared across his mustache. When told his truck had no rear license plate, Rifkin assured the officers it had been present when he left his home some 40 minutes earlier. He had no explanation for the wild flight to avoid a minor traffic ticket, but the cause of Rifkin's panic was revealed a moment later. Drawn to the pickup's bed by a foul odor, troopers peeled back a blue tarp and found a woman's naked, decomposing corpse. She appeared to have been dead for several days. That explained Rifkin's use of Noxzema. It was a trick for handling corpses to avoid their stench, portrayed by Hollywood 2 years earlier in the Oscar-winning Silence of the Lambs. When asked about the body, Rifkin said, "She was a prostitute. I picked her up on Allen Street in Manhattan. I had sex with her, then things went bad, and I strangled her. Do you think I need a lawyer?" Rifkin was booked at Hempstead, where homicide detectives launched a marathon investigation. Officers staked out the house in East Meadow, where Rifkin lived with his sister and elderly mother. A telephone call from the police told 71-year-old Jean Rifkin that her son had been detained after a traffic accident. The rest would be revealed to her on television hours later, when detectives laid the outline of their case before the media. Rifkin's victim was identified as Tiffany Bresciani, a 22-year-old Louisiana native, tricking in Manhattan the past 2 years to feed her drug habit. During questioning, Rifkin described her death in clinical detail, but his emotional detachment was not the worst part of the confession. The murder, detectives gathered, was not his first. Bresciani was number 17, Rifkin said. It was nearly 8 p.m. when authorities presented Jean Rifkin with a search warrant, scouring her 2-story house for evidence against the man who appeared to be New York's most prolific serial killer. When they left, 6 hours later, the searchers carried off at least 228 items. One report claimed there were more than 1,000, linked to Rifkin's 4-year murder spree. His upstairs bedroom yielded 75 pieces of women's jewelry, photographs Rifkin had taken of several unidentified women, various items of feminine clothing, makeup cases, a woman's curling iron, wallets and pocketbooks, plus a mixed bag of ID cards. One driver's license belonged to Mary DeLuca, found dead in Cornwall, New York in October 1991. Another belonged to Jenny Soto, fished out of the Harlem River in November 1992. Rifkin's bedroom reading material included a book on the unidentified Green River Killer and news clippings about the case of New York serial slayer Arthur Shawcross. In Rifkin's cluttered garage, detectives followed their noses to a reeking wheelbarrow, extracting 3 ounces of human blood. A pair of women's panties lay on the floor near a stockpile of rope and tarp. A chainsaw found in the garage was stained with blood and bits of human flesh. Neighbors recalled strange odors emanating from Rifkin's garage, but they had assumed he stored insecticides there for use in his garden and landscaping business. They were wrong. It was the smell of death, and it would linger long after the source had been removed. He was born on January 20th, 1959, the son of unwed college students who were not prepared to start a family. A childless couple from upstate New York, Bernard and Jean Rifkin, adopted him on Valentine's Day and named him Joel David. The Rifkins also adopted a daughter, Jan, in 1962. 3 years later, they moved to East Meadow, Long Island, and Joel entered first grade at Prospect Avenue Elementary School. It was hell from day one. Something about Joel Rifkin set him apart, an undefined quality that made him an immediate outsider, natural prey to all manner of bullies. Classmates dubbed him the Turtle after his slouching posture and slow gait. Excluded from team sports and neighborhood games, Joel was the butt of every prank and sadistic joke. Bullies assaulted him in school and pulled his pants down, stole his lunch and books, and harassed him constantly. He was also an academic failure, suffering from undiagnosed dyslexia, despite a tested IQ of 128. Joel's poor grades embarrassed his father, a member of the East Meadows School Board. He raged at Joel. "Why can't you do anything to please me?" Jean Rifkin shared her love of gardening and photography with Joel, oblivious to his torment by peers. "I thought of him as a loner," she subsequently told reporters. "It didn't fully come home to me what was happening until later." Things went from bad to worse at East Meadow High School. Except for his grades, Joel was the stereotypical nerd in glasses and high-water pants with white socks. One of the bullies who harassed him later called Rifkin an abuse unit. He was subtly obnoxious, like his presence annoyed you. Rifkin joined the track team in an effort to fit in and was rewarded by the nickname Lardass. Teammates hid his clothes and shoved his head into a toilet bowl. Instead of fighting back, Rifkin invited them to watch TV and drink beer at his house. "We used him, to be blunt about it," one of them recalled years later. "He was easy to make fun of." A failure in athletics, Rifkin joined the yearbook staff and promptly had his camera stolen. Undeterred, he slaved to put the senior yearbook out, but was excluded from the year-end wrap party. That left him absolutely devastated, in his mother's words. But there were other compensations. Joel's parents gave him a car that year, and he used it to troll for prostitutes, first in nearby Hampstead, later in Manhattan. According to Robert Mladenich, in From the Mouth of the Monster, Joel's fantasies included some bondage and some rape, plus a gladiator-type thing with two girls who would fight to the death. In some daydreams, he raped and stabbed women, but his fantasy victims were silent, just passive about it. After a 1972 viewing of Alfred Hitchcock's Frenzy, loosely based on London's Jack the Ripper homicides of 1964 and 65, he fixated on strangling prostitutes. Real-life romance eluded Rifkin, for the most part. One high school date was scuttled after fellow track team members trapped him in the gym and pelted him with eggs, forcing Joel to call his father for help. Another time, Rifkin made it as far as a local pizza parlor with his date, but the same bullies chased them out, pursuing the couple on foot until Joel and the girl found refuge in a public library. Graduating near the bottom of his class in 1977, Joel Rifkin looked forward to college and adulthood. Life could only get better, he reasoned. But the worst was yet to come. Rifkin's first attempt at higher education took him to Nassau Community College on Long Island. Bored and restless, he cut classes habitually, completing only one course in the 1977-78 academic year. Rifkin transferred to the State University at Brockport, a Rochester suburb, in fall of 1978. He enjoyed the photography club, but turned in his usual lackluster academic performance over the next 2 years before dropping out in 1980. Rifkin had his only real girlfriend in Brockport, but the relationship went nowhere, his paramour recalling Joel as sweet but always depressed. Back at home with his parents, Rifkin tried Nassau Community College again, attending erratically, earning only 12 credits by the time he finally quit in 1984. Throughout the 1980s, Rifkin worked a series of odd jobs around Long Island, seldom staying long at any. Poor hygiene, chronic absenteeism, and general ineptitude blocked the road to advancement. His employer at a local music store described Joel as a total piece of work. This guy couldn't even count to 10. In his downtime, idling between jobs and classes, Rifkin dreamed of becoming a famous writer, churning out fragments of bleak poetry. He maintained his interest in photography and horticulture, but failed to make either a paying proposition. Joel left his parents several times, renting small apartments, but he was never gone long, always moving home again when his latest job fell through. In Robert Mladenich's The Joel Rifkin Story, Rifkin confessed that in those years, "I couldn't put 2 nickels together, and most of what he did earn went to prostitutes. The whole focus of my life," he later said, "was on the streets." Even there, he proved inept, robbed by hookers or their pimps at least a dozen times. One girl duped him twice. using the same ruse both times to flee with his cash before sex. Rifkin's father was chronically ill, a heavy smoker already afflicted with emphysema. Bernard was diagnosed with prostate cancer in the fall of 1986. Weary of the pain by February 1987, he took a massive dose of barbiturates and died after 4 days in a coma. Joel delivered a eulogy at his father's funeral, moving the mourners to tears, and his depression deepened. He was arrested in Hampstead in August 1987 after soliciting sex from an undercover policewoman, but he escaped with a nominal fine. Instead of keeping him away from prostitutes, the incident made him more devious. In 1988, Rifkin enrolled in a 2-year horticulture study program at the State College of Technology in Farmingdale, New York. For the first time in his life, he made straight A's for 2 consecutive semesters, rewarded by selection for an internship at the prestigious Planting Fields Arboretum in Oyster Bay, New York. The appointment was an honor, and it had an unexpected bonus. Joel found himself strongly attracted to one of the other interns, a pretty blonde. But while he shadowed her at every opportunity, he never found the nerve to ask her out. Instead, he concocted an elaborate fantasy affair, frustrated beyond endurance when she failed to reciprocate his secret passion. It was finally too much. Years of pent-up anger and humiliation craved release. Rifkin had reached the detonation point. All he required now was a target. Despite his history of morbid fantasy, Rifkin would later claim he had to plan the murder of his first victim in March 1989. Rifkin acknowledged that his violent mental images were a little more intense than regular at that time. His mother chose that month to travel out of state, leaving Joel alone in the East Meadow house. Cruising Manhattan's East Village for hookers one night, at around 10 p.m., he selected a young woman remembered only as Susie. She was a hardcore drug addict, demanding several stops to purchase crack before they drove back to Long Island. After listless sex, Susie again asked Joel to take her out in search of drugs. Instead, he picked up a souvenir howitzer shell and beat her furiously. "I just lost control," he said later. "I stopped when I got tired." Susie was still alive, however, and she fought back when he tried to move her, biting one of Rifkin's fingers deeply before he strangled her to death. After wrestling her body into a plastic trash bag, Rifkin cleaned up the blood and signs of combat in his living room, then lay down and slept for several hours as if nothing had happened. Upon waking, he dragged Susie down to the basement, draped her body across the washer and dryer, then used that makeshift operating table to dismember her corpse with an X-Acto knife. In his mind, the grim task was reduced to biology class. To foil identification, Rifkin severed Susie's fingertips and pulled her teeth with pliers, then jammed her severed head into an old paint can. The other parts went into garbage bags and then into his mother's car. Rifkin drove the body parts across the state line to New Jersey, dropping the head and legs into the woods near Hopewell. Doubling back from there, he returned to Manhattan, pitching the arms and torso into the East River. Rifkin believed his victim would never be found, but he had been careless. On March 5, 1989, a member of the Hopewell Valley Golf Club sliced his ball into the woods along the 7th green and found the can containing Susie's head. Rifkin suffered a major anxiety attack after learning that Susie was HIV positive, following the case as police prepared artist renderings of the victim in life and checked them against a list of 700 missing women. Her case remained unsolved until Rifkin confessed in 1993. Joel waited more than a year to claim his second victim. He was vague on dates, different reports placing the crime 14 months after Susie's murder or late in 1990. The victim was prostitute Julie Blackbird, selected for her pseudo-Madonna look. Rifkin drove her home to East Meadow when his mother was again out of town, and they spent the night together. At about 9 the next morning, Rifkin recalled completely bugging out, beating Blackbird with a heavy table leg before he strangled her. When she was dead, he considered ripping her corpse in conscious emulation of serial killer Ted Bundy, but the prospect repulsed him. Determined not to bungle the disposal this time, Rifkin went out to purchase cement and a large mortar pan. He dismembered the corpse as before, placing the head, arms, and legs in buckets weighted with concrete. The torso filled a milk crate by itself. Driving into Manhattan, he consigned Blackbird's head and torso to the East River, then dropped her weighted arms and legs into a Brooklyn barge canal. The remains were never found. We know Blackbird's fate today only from Rifkin's confession and from her diary stashed in his bedroom. Murder was easy. Joel couldn't wait to play the deadly game again. Rifkin started his own landscaping business in April 1991, renting space at a local nursery to store his equipment. It was a half-hearted effort at best. He complained to his landlord, "I keep losing all my customers," and by summer, he was falling behind on his rent. The obsession with murder had consumed his life, and he began using the rented job site as a way station for corpses in transit. Barbara Jacobs was the next to die. A 31-year-old addict with arrests on her record for auto theft and prostitution. Joel picked her up on July 13, 1991, and took her home to East Meadow for sex. When she fell asleep, he clubbed her with the same table leg he had used on Julie Blackbird, then finished the job by manual strangulation. Put off by the thought of another dismemberment, Rifkin wrapped Jacobs in plastic, folded her into a cardboard box, and placed her in the back of his mother's Toyota pickup. He drove to the Hudson River, dropping her into the water near a cement plant. She was found hours later by firefighters on a training exercise. But this time, Rifkin reported, "It didn't even faze me." The coroner blamed her death on a drug overdose, and Jacobs was buried in Potter's Field Cemetery, unidentified until Rifkin confessed to her murder 2 years later. Crack addict Mary Ellen DeLuca, a 22-year-old Long Island native, was last seen alive at 11 p.m. on September 1, 1991, when she left a group of friends to earn the price of her next fix. Rifkin found her on Jamaica Avenue in Queens and drove her around New York until sunrise, shelling out $150 for drugs at various stops. They wound up at a cheap motel, DeLuca first balking at sex and demanding more dope, then rushing through the act, complaining all the while. At some point in the litany, Rifkin asked DeLuca if she wanted to die, and she allegedly said yes. As he strangled her, Rifkin recalled, "She did nothing, just accepted it." He remembered her murder as one of the weird ones. It also left Rifkin with a new problem. Afraid to drag the corpse out in broad daylight, he drew inspiration from Hitchcock's Frenzy and went out to purchase a cheap steamer trunk, squeezing DeLuca inside it. From the motel, he drove upstate to Orange County and left DeLuca's body at a rest stop outside Cornwall, near West Point. She was found on October 1st, nude except for a brassiere, without ID. Decomposition made it impossible to determine a cause of death, and she was buried nameless, unidentified until June 1993. Rifkin's selection process was erratic, sparing most of the hookers he patronized on a near-nightly basis, prompting him to kill others on a whim. On the September night he picked up 31-year-old Yun Lee, a Korean native he had been with before. She was his second prostitute in an hour. That may explain his failure to perform as Lee went to work. He struck her on impulse, strangling her while she mouthed something about making a big mistake. It was Rifkin's first murder of someone he knew beforehand, and he experienced fleeting remorse. "Actually," he said later, "I thought I liked her." Rifkin wedged Lee into the same steamer trunk he'd used for Mary DeLuca and dropped her in the East River. She was found on September 23rd, 8 days before DeLuca, floating past Randall's Island at the Harlem River's mouth. Lee's ex-husband identified the body, sparing her from an unmarked grave. Rifkin could not recall the name of Number 6, murdered a few days shy of Christmas 1991. He picked her up on West 46th Street in Manhattan and strangled her in his car during oral sex, describing the event as very quick. Afterward, he drove back to Long Island with the body slumped beside him, concealing her under a tarp at his rented workspace. Next, he drove to a recycling plant in Westbury, where he had once worked part-time, and helped himself to a 55-gallon oil drum. There was ample room for Jane Doe in the barrel, safely hidden for their ride to the South Bronx, where Rifkin found a district rife with junkyards and rolled her into the East River. About to leave, he was confronted by patrolmen who accused him of illegal dumping, but Joel persuaded him he was collecting junk instead. They let him go with a warning. The oil drum worked so well for Rifkin that he purchased several more for use as makeshift coffins. He used the next one on Lorraine Orvieto, a 28-year-old manic depressive who tried to control her mood swings with cocaine. The habit was expensive, and she tricked to keep herself supplied. It was a life far removed from her affluent Long Island home, where she'd been a high school cheerleader. Rifkin found Orvieto on December 26, 1991, in Bayshore, Long Island. He parked near a schoolyard fence and strangled her while she performed oral sex, discovering her HIV-positive status when he found a bottle of AZT in her purse. He kept the pills, along with Orvieto's jewelry and ID, as souvenirs of the kill. Back at the landscaping lot, Rifkin stuffed her into an oil drum, drove her body to Brooklyn, and dropped it into Coney Island Creek. She was found by a fisherman on July 11, 1992, 2 months before her family filed a missing person report. Even the parents of his victims didn't seem to miss Rifkin's prey. It was a killer's dream come true. Success breeds repetition. 1 week after he killed Lorraine Orvieto, on January 2, 1992, Rifkin went hunting again. At 39, Marianne Holloman was his oldest victim, an addict who sewed personalized G-strings for strippers when she wasn't working the street. Rifkin drove her to the same parking lot where he had killed Yun Lee and strangled her during fellatio. Later, he recalled the act as very automatic, not much with that one. He followed the same disposal procedure as with Orvieto, back to Long Island, the oil drum, the Coney Island Creek. An anonymous caller reported Holloman's floating remains to police on July 9, 1992, 2 days before Orvieto's corpse was found. Unlike Orvieto, Holloman was identified from dental records and returned to her family for burial. 2 floaters in as many days suggested a serial killer at large, but New York police had their hands full with 2,000 murders a year in those days, and junkie prostitutes were never a high priority. Rifkin's 9th victim, ironically, surfaced before numbers 7 and 8. He was vague on the details in later confessions, unable to recall the woman's name if he had ever known it. He remembered her tattoos, a pickup in Manhattan, and the way she fought for life when he began to strangle her. She followed Mary Holloman sometime that winter, dismembered remains consigned to the last of Rifkin's oil drums. He dropped her into Brooklyn's Newton Creek, where she was spotted floating with the current, foot protruding from the rusty barrel, on May 13, 1992. The cocaine in her system prompted detectives to brand her a drug mule, killed accidentally by the rupture of drug-filled condoms in her stomach. Police learned their mistake a year later when Rifkin confessed to her slaying, but number 9 remains anonymous, the last Jane Doe. Rifkin went back to school in the spring of 1992, taking uncredited classes at SUNY Farmingdale. His landscaping business had folded by then, his landlord clamoring for $700 in overdue rent. As before, Joel cut most of his classes, focusing for the most part on repairing his truck, renting video porn, and trolling for prey. He found Iris Sanchez, a 25-year-old crack addict, working First Avenue on Mother's Day weekend. Rifkin was AWOL from his part-time job at an East Meadow liquor store, looking for trouble. He picked Sanchez up in broad daylight, driving her to a Manhattan housing project, down by where Macy's had the fireworks. After strangling Sanchez during sex, he drove her corpse across the Brooklyn Bridge, seeking a drop-off point. The site he chose was an illegal dump 200 feet off Rockaway Boulevard, within sight of JFK International Airport. Rifkin wedged the body underneath a rotting mattress, first relieving Sanchez of her watch and other jewelry. She would not be found until June 1993, when Rifkin drew detectives a map. At age 33, Ana Lopez had 3 children by 3 different fathers, but she worked the streets primarily to feed her own cocaine addiction. Rifkin found her on May 25, 1992, Memorial Day, working Atlantic Avenue in Queens, and retired to a nearby residential street for sex. After strangling Lopez in his car, Rifkin drove through the night to Brewster in Putnam County and dumped her corpse along I-84. A motorist stopping to relieve himself found Lopez the next day. She was missing one earring, later found in Rifkin's bedroom stash. Violet O'Neill, a 21-year-old prostitute, was the first victim Rifkin had taken home to East Meadow in nearly a year. He picked her up in the city, strangled her after sex at his mother's house, and dismembered her corpse in the bathtub. Rifkin consigned her remains to the waters surrounding Manhattan. Her torso surfaced in the Hudson River, wrapped in black plastic, while her arms and legs were found in a discarded suitcase. Mary Catherine Williams, 10 years older than O'Neill, had been a high school homecoming queen and college cheerleader in her native North Carolina. Married to a pro football player in 1986 and divorced the following year, she had come to New York in search of an acting career, but wound up doing drugs and living on the street. Rifkin had dated Williams twice and enjoyed a great time before the final pickup on October 2, 1992. He bought Williams a fix that night, then tried to choke her when she dozed off in his mother's car. She woke up fighting for her life, kicking the gear shift hard enough to snap it off before Joel smothered her. After a struggle to get the car started and moving, Rifkin drove Williams to Yorktown, a Westchester suburb, where she was found on December 21, 1992. He kept her credit cards and a wicker handbag filled with costume jewelry, so much, in fact, that the amount would briefly cause detectives to inflate his body count. Williams would fill another nameless pauper's grave until Rifkin confessed to her murder 6 months after she was found. Jenny Soto was the last victim of 1992, a 23-year-old addict whose many trips to detox never turned her life around. Rifkin picked her up at about 11 p.m. on November 16th, near the Williamsburg Bridge in Lower Manhattan. Strangled in Joel's pickup after sex, she proved the toughest one to kill, he said, breaking all 10 fingernails as she clawed Rifkin's face and neck. Winded from the battle, Rifkin claimed her bra and panties, earrings, ID cards, and drug syringe as trophies for his cash. He rolled Soto into the Harlem River near the spot where Yun Lee had been found 14 months earlier. Discovered the following day, Soto was identified from fingerprint records of her last arrest, police initially suspecting her ex-con ex-boyfriend of the murder. Soto's grim fight for life gave Rifkin pause. Her slaying capped his own frenzied acceleration period and left him with embarrassing wounds to explain. Joel would not strike again for 15 weeks, and when he did, he would take better care to hide his tracks. Rifkin's first victim of 1993 was Leah Evans, a 28-year-old who lived with her mother in Brooklyn. Abandoned by the father of her 2 children, Evans found solace in drugs and worked the streets to keep herself well. Rifkin found her tricking on February 27, 1993, stopping for sex in an abandoned parking lot. Evans started to undress, then balked, demanding greater privacy. Rifkin refused, strangling her when she started to cry. Afterward, he drove Evans to the far eastern end of Long Island and buried her in the woods, the only one of his victims who raided a shallow grave. Hikers found her on May 9th after they spied a withered hand protruding from the ground. A forensic anthropologist was hired to reconstruct the victim's face, but Rifkin confessed before the model was finished. Police found Evans' driver's license at his home. The next to die, Lauren Marquez, was a 28-year-old addict and prostitute, hooked on drugs before she left her native Tennessee for New York City. Rifkin picked her up on April 2, 1993, while she was working 2nd Avenue. They drove to a point near the Manhattan Bridge, Rifkin clutching at her throat without the usual preliminaries. Briefly distracted by a man who passed the car walking a dog, he almost let Marquez escape. She fought him, resisting strangulation until he snapped her neck. Rifkin dumped her body in the Suffolk County Pine Barrens, where she lay undiscovered until his arrest. Besides a broken neck, Marquez had fractured ribs, though Rifkin claimed he could not remember hitting her. She was identified through DNA testing on August 20th, 1993. Rifkin's last victim, Tiffany Bresciani, was another Southern girl. She hailed from Metairie, Louisiana, and had been drawn to New York by dreams of acting or dancing. Instead, she wound up hooked on heroin, performing for strangers in strip clubs and cars. By the time Rifkin found her in the pre-dawn hours of June 24, 1993, she was his second hooker of the night, his fourth within 2 days. Rifkin picked her up on Allen Street and drove her to the New York Post's parking lot, where he strangled her at 5:30 a.m. From there, he drove back to East Meadow, stopping at stores along the way for rope and tarp, while Bresciani lay sprawled in the back seat of his mother's car. By the time he got home, she was swaddled in a tarp and concealed in the trunk. Rifkin had just arrived home when his mother demanded her car keys and embarked on a 30-minute shopping trip, with the corpse still in the trunk. Rifkin had no time to move the corpse, but his mother never knew. Relieved of his little anxiety attack, Joel moved Bresciani into the cluttered garage, leaving her body in a wheelbarrow. Then, as if in a fugue state, he spent the next 3 days working on his pickup, ignoring the summer heat and pervasive reek of decomposing flesh. He was on his way to dump the corpse near Melville's Republic Airport, some 15 miles north of his house, when troopers Ruane and Spargaran noted his lack of a rear license plate. The killing game was over, but the quest for justice had only begun. Homicide detectives began interrogating Rifkin at 8:25 a.m. on June 28, 1993. They questioned him for 8 hours, but for some reason never recorded the sessions. Rifkin later claimed that he asked for a lawyer at least 20 times and was always refused. Investigators telling him he couldn't speak with counsel until "you give us one more homicide." The written transcript of his interview, presumably reconstructed from memory, suggests that Rifkin was offered a lawyer and declined. He described all 17 murders in the absence of counsel, writing out the names he remembered, sketching maps to help police find those victims still missing. Rifkin was dispassionate, referring to the murders as events or incidents, listing his victims by number. Mary Catherine Williams was number 13, Joel's omission of her name confusing police and some reporters into citing Williams as his 18th victim. Their mistake made Rifkin laugh, explaining that the clumsy cops had counted Williams twice. Back in East Meadow, Jean Rifkin found officers circling her house by mid-morning. Confronting them, she was told first that Joel had been detained after a traffic accident, then that he was jailed for a crime which the officers refused to describe. A 9 a.m. media report cleared up the mystery, and Jean phoned her lawyer, who referred her to criminal attorney Robert Sale. Sale called the state police at 3:30 p.m. and ordered them to cease interrogation of his client, but the questioning continued in Sale's absence for at least another hour, until Rifkin completed his grim recital of death. His memory was far from perfect. Rifkin had apparently forgotten the date of his father's death and told police he murdered Barbara Jacobs in August 1991, although her body had been found in July. He had forgotten the names of several victims and knew others only by their street names. He directed police to the remains of Lauren Marquez and Iris Sanchez, found 5 hours apart on June 29th, but Julie Blackbird was gone forever. Robert Sale met his new client for the first time at 9 a.m. on June 29th, and Rifkin complained the police had taken his glasses and left him with a migraine headache, unable to function. 30 minutes later, Sale and Rifkin appeared before Judge John Kingston, entering a preliminary plea of not guilty on the Bresciani murder. Sale waived application for bond, knowing it was hopeless, but won a 2-week postponement of formal arraignment. Rifkin was transferred at once to the Nassau County Correctional Facility in East Meadow. The prison van carried him past the high school where he had graduated 16 years before. Arraigned for the Bresciani homicide on July 15, 1993, Rifkin repeated his plea of not guilty. His lawyer, Bob Sale, sought to have Rifkin's confession thrown out on grounds the police could not prove he was ever advised of his rights. Failing that, he sought to have the various murder charges consolidated in one Nassau County trial, hoping a hometown jury would be more inclined to find Rifkin not guilty by reason of insanity. A formal suppression hearing was scheduled for November, but Rifkin had other plans. Flexing his ego, he fired Sale and retained two new lawyers, former Nassau County Assistant District Attorney Michael Shoshnik and his partner John Lawrence. The suppression hearing convened before Judge Ira Wexner on November 8, 1993, Shoshnik and Lawrence picking up where Sale left off in the effort to quash Rifkin's confession. They also sought to suppress his initial admission of Bresciani's murder, made at the time of his arrest, while claiming the police had lacked sufficient probable cause for a legal search of Rifkin's truck. Midway through the hearing, Assistant District Attorney Fred Klein offered Rifkin a sweetheart deal, 46 years to life on all 17 murders, in return for a blanket guilty plea. But Rifkin refused the bargain, apparently convinced that he would be acquitted on grounds of insanity. As the hearing dragged on, Rifkin's lawyer alienated Judge Wexner by Shoshnik repeatedly arriving late for court and unprepared, and Lawrence missing whole days. By March 1994, Wexner had heard enough to reject the various defense motions outright and hold Rifkin for trial, scheduled for mid-April. Rifkin responded to the news by firing Shoshnik on the spot, leaving Lawrence, a lawyer with no criminal experience, to wage the battle alone. Jury selection for Rifkin's first trial, before Wexner, began on April 11, 1994. A panel of 7 men and 5 women were seated 9 days later, with opening arguments begun on April 20th. Fred Klein described Rifkin as a sexual sadist who relished his victim's suffering. Mladinich quotes from the trial, "He got caught red-handed, and now he's using and abusing the concept of mental illness." Lawrence called his client a paranoid schizophrenic who lived in the twilight zone, overwhelmed by violent, irresistible compulsions that took control of his life. Rifkin, for his part, snored through much of the prosecution's case, a performance Lawrence blamed on allergies to a bologna sandwich he ate in jail. Long Island psychiatrist Barbara Kirwan deemed Rifkin's psychological test results the most pathological she had seen in 20 years of practice. Appearing for the state, Dr. Park Deitz, earlier prosecution witness against Arthur Shawcross, Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Hinckley, found Rifkin sick but not insane. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it. Jurors agreed with Deitz, deliberating briefly on May 9th before they convicted Rifkin of murder and reckless endangerment for leading police on the wild car chase. Wexner gave Rifkin 25 years to life for murder, plus 2 1/3 to 7 years on the lesser charge. Even before he was sentenced on May 9, 1994, Rifkin was transferred to Suffolk County, pending trial for the Evans and Marquez slayings. Another suppression hearing failed to quash his confession, whereupon Rifkin pleaded guilty on both counts, receiving 2 more consecutive terms of 25 years to life in prison. In November, he pleaded guilty to the Sanchez homicide in Queens and to 3 more counts in Brooklyn, victims Orvieto, Holloman, and the Jane Doe killed in 1992. By January 1996, Rifkin was scheduled to serve at least 183 years for 7 slayings, with 10 counts outstanding. Mladinich quotes Judge Robert Hannafy, passing sentence in the Sanchez case, who told spectators, "It is not in my power to give Mr. Rifkin the sentence he deserves. In case there is such a thing as reincarnation, I want you to spend your second life in prison." In 2002, New York Supreme Court rejected Rifkin's appeal of his convictions for the murder of 9 women. His lawyer argued that his statements to the police at the time of his arrest should be suppressed because he had not been informed of his rights. Joel Rifkin is now serving 203 years to life in the Clinton, New York Correctional Facility. He will be eligible for parole in 2197. Rifkin arrived at Attica State Prison in February 1996, sporting a black eye from his first assault by fellow inmates while confined on Rikers Island. The prison was an exaggerated replay of high school, with constant threats and taunts from other convicts. Although never housed in the prison's general population, Rifkin created enough disruption by his mere presence that administrators moved him into IPC, Involuntary Protective Custody, where prisoners spent 23 hours a day confined to their Spartan cells. Aside from books and magazines, no more than 10 per isolation cell, Rifkin had lawsuits to amuse himself. The Orvieto family sued him first on a civil count for Lorraine's wrongful death, and Rifkin responded with a snide, handwritten brief branding his victim as an AIDS carrier who may be responsible for the eventual deaths of numerous individuals, crediting her relatives for shared responsibility in what might have been. Next, in November 1997, it was Rifkin's turn to sue prison officials and the New York Daily News for branding him HIV positive. According to Rifkin's complaint, the reports prompted a series of inmate assaults that he suffered in January and February 1996, leading to his confinement in a solitary cell for personal safety. The next time Rifkin made headlines, in April 1998, the news involved the sale of his artwork at the New York State Legislature's office building in Albany as part of a program to compensate crime victims. 50% of the proceeds from sales were earmarked for New York's Crime Victims Board, with inmate artists retaining the rest. Most of Rifkin's 20 paintings and sketches depicted wildlife or flowers, but one, titled Guardian's Failure, showed a bare foot with a coroner's toe tag and an angel weeping in the corner. Buoyed perhaps by that effort, in August 1999, Rifkin unveiled his plans for Ohola House, a proposed shelter for prostitutes that would include drug treatment, counseling, medical care, and job training. Ohola, Rifkin explained, was both the Hebrew word for sanctuary and the name of a prostitute whose violent death is described in Ezekiel 23, 3-10. In fact, the latter name is spelled Ahola. Rifkin called his plan a way of paying back a debt, I guess. And while the idea drew praise from some quarters, including prosecutor Fred Klein, most objected to Rifkin's inclusion of a motivation room where residents would be scared straight with photos of hookers murdered on the job. These girls think, I can't be touched, Rifkin explained. Well, 17 girls thought that, and now they're dead. Good works notwithstanding, Rifkin had no luck in his bids to escape solitary confinement. By unanimous decision, a New York appellate court refused to lift the lockdown in June 2000. Days later, Rifkin was transferred from Attica to the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, long known as the Siberia of New York prisons, isolated in the Adirondack Mountains, 350 miles north of Manhattan. On December 14, 2001, Rifkin lost the latest appeal of his conviction. Despite finding that Wexner should have excluded Rifkin's confession to the Bresciani murder, an argument pursued in vain for 5 years, the appellate court found overwhelming evidence establishing his guilt and refused to overturn any part of his sentence. In early 1994, it was reported that Rifkin had engaged in a jailhouse scuffle with mass murderer Colin Ferguson over the use of a public telephone. The argument over whose killings were better reportedly ended with Ferguson punching Rifkin in the mouth. On a spring night in 1977, an unremarkable 26-year-old Kansas City, Missouri man named Lorenzo Gilyard began strangling prostitutes in his hometown. By the time he stopped, in 1993, at age 42, Gilyard had killed at least 13 women. He was caught in 2004 when DNA evidence dropped into the lap of the city's homicide detectives. A fortunate fluke, one forensic expert called it. 3 years later, at age 56, Gilyard was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the probability of parole. It's an unusual case, but not because Gilyard targeted prostitutes. The world's violent psychopaths have long favored streetwalkers as victims, dating to even before London's Jack the Ripper went on his famous spree in the 1880s. The women work in an edgy business, and their clients are not expected to produce references. The case is unusual in that few Americans outside metropolitan Kansas City have ever heard of Lorenzo Gilyard. He murdered more women than Jack the Ripper, and we shrugged. But since Gilyard began his crimes, other serial murderers have targeted prostitutes in places like New Orleans, Phoenix, San Diego, Seattle, Vancouver, Los Angeles, Indianapolis, Detroit, Rochester, New York, Daytona Beach, Florida, Atlantic City, New Jersey, and Ipswich, England. Prostitutes are fantastic targets for crazy people. You have easy access to them. They will willingly go away with strangers while no one is watching. When they disappear, few people will notice. It couldn't be easier. The sheer volume of these easy murders has pushed America into serial killer overload. There are so many, in so many places, that we simply can't keep up, or don't want to. What's happened is that we've become used to this sort of thing. It used to be that you'd murder 2 or 3 people and everyone in the country would know your name. You were a famous killer. Now, a guy kills 13 and nobody's ever heard of him. Someone like this knocks off women from the dark sides of life, from the margins, and in our society, he's hardly worth mentioning. Our sensitivities have become blunted. It no longer shocks us. To make big news, you have to kill a famous person or a lot of people in a place where homicide is not expected. The Gilyard case escaped the attention of even the Sex Workers Outreach Project, an international advocacy group for prostitutes that pays special attention to murders of streetwalkers. The case won scant notice from the national media, which treated it as just another batch of throwaway murders. The media is just a projection of what people care about. Most people really don't care about some prostitutes who go missing or die. They were just pieces of trash, Gary Ridgway, the Green River serial killer, once said of the 48 prostitutes he murdered in the Northwest. They were garbage. Too many law enforcers pick up on that theme and treat serial killers of streetwalkers as garbage collectors. If your job as a cop involves doing sweeps to get prostitutes off the street, then you are all about trying to get these people to go away, a sex worker advocate said. If somebody kills a few of them, then you might be thinking, gee, this is making my life easier. I'm not saying a cop would say that out loud, but it might be a subconscious motivation. And that attitude trickles down through the media and the public. When Gilyard killed his final victim, Connie Luther, in the winter of 1993, her demise rated about 100 words on page 6 of the local news section of the Kansas City Star, the city's newspaper of record. The nude body of a Kansas City woman was found Monday on a sidewalk on the city's west side. The woman, Connie Luther, 29, was found about 6:30 a.m. near 25th and Allen Streets, investigators said. Police think she was killed elsewhere. A man who was driving to work Monday told police he discovered Luther's nude body face down in the snow among leaves and trash. Police have no suspects or motive. An autopsy will be performed to determine the cause of death. Kansas City, a 2-state metropolitan area with a population of roughly 2 million, is hardly a backwater outpost. People there are accustomed to big city crime, having begun their orientation in the 1880s when the power broker Pendergast family began its artful merger of politics and vice. Even so, in the year that Luther was killed, the city averaged fewer than 2 homicides a week. Yet, the hooker murder rated only a brief at the back of the local newspaper. To be fair, a reporter can't make much out of such bare details. But, in retrospect, those no-detail homicides deserved a closer look. As is often the case, the most important crime stories spring not from the unusual cases, but from the routine ones. Some of the murders were more heavily publicized than others, particularly during a flurry of hooker homicides in 1987. Police knew they had a serial killer on their hands, and at one point, someone ponied up a $1,000 reward, which equates to about $77 for each of the 13 victims. The killer was ecumenical in his tastes. His victims ranged in age from 15 to 36. 9 were white, 4 black. Most were garroted with whatever was at hand, their own clothing in several cases, an electrical cord in one, a shoestring in another. The victims had cloth or paper towels stuffed in their mouths, probably to muffle screams. Most had been sexually assaulted and showed the telltale scratches, cuts, and broken fingernails of someone who fought for their lives. Many were naked and missing shoes, and detectives mulled the possibility that a foot fetishist was at work. Several victims were found downtown but others were scattered over a wide geographic area in and around the city. Police surmised that most were murdered in one place and dumped in another. The first 3 victims were wayward teenagers working as novice street prostitutes. Stacy Swofford, 17, killed in April 1977 and dumped in a rubble-strewn lot. Gwen Kizine, at 15, the youngest victim, left dead in an alley in January 1980, and Margaret Miller, 17, found in a vacant lot in May 1982. The murder of Kizine rated the most attention of the 3 because she was so young. Relatives said she was a happy-go-lucky kid who had once attended a Holy Roller church until she took up with a bad crowd and turned to drugs, the companion crime of prostitution. A week after Miller was murdered, Lorenzo Gilyard went to prison on a felony conviction, and the serial killings ceased for nearly 4 years. They resumed with a violent flurry of 8 murders that began a few months after he was paroled. The first was on March 14, 1986, when the body of Catherine Barry was found under scrap plywood in a derelict building a few miles from downtown, her usual haunt. Barry, 34, was the only victim who was not a prostitute. She was a mother of 3 who had a mental breakdown and ended up on the streets. 2 other women were killed 14 weeks apart later that year. Naomi Kelly, 23, found on August 16th, and Debbie Blevins, 32, found on November 27th, Thanksgiving Day. Kelly, a single mother, was found strangled in a needle park downtown. The body of Blevins, naked except for socks, had been dumped outside a church not far from the trendy Westport neighborhood. In 1987, 5 more corpses turned up. Ann Barnes, 36, a stripper, was found murdered on April 17, 1987, which was both Good Friday and the 10-year anniversary of the murder of Stacy Swofford, the first victim. 7 weeks later, Kellyanne Ford, a 20-year-old junkie hooker, was found strangled in a city park. On September 12th, the shoeless corpse of Angela Mayhew, 19, turned up in North Kansas City. Next was Sheila Ingold, 36, found dead in a van on Troost Avenue, a popular trawling ground for Johns. Carmeline Hibbs, 30, was found murdered on December 19th in the parking lot on Broadway, about 16 blocks from where Ingold's corpse turned up. Like Mayhew, Hibbs was shoeless on a cold December night. The pace of the serial killings slowed after that brutal stretch. The body of Helga Kruger, 26, an Austrian national, was found on Troost Avenue on February 12, 1989. 4 years later, Connie Luther, the presumed final victim, was found dead in January 1993. The conventional wisdom is that serial killers never stop of their own volition. Once the compulsion to kill sets in, it can never be satisfied. The murdering ceases only when a killer dies or goes to prison, or so say the experts. But Lorenzo Gilyard violated the conventional wisdom. He stopped. No one knows why, since he has never admitted that he ever started. The experts also say that serial killers often have a violent pedigree, that savagery breeds savagery. This was true with Gilyard. His father was convicted of rape in 1970. Lorenzo's sister, Patricia Dixon, a prostitute, stabbed a customer to death in 1983 and was later implicated in the killing of another hooker. His younger brother, Daryl, is serving life without parole in Missouri for a 1989 drug murder. Daryl Gilyard is a notable show-me state inmate. He pays $1,100 a month in prison room and board from a $4.3 million settlement he won in 1986 after his legs were severed in a garbage truck accident. Lorenzo Gilyard, a stocky 5'9" man with bare claw hands, was wired for violence. Over his lifetime, he assaulted friends, relatives, and strangers, while again and again managing to dodge hard prison time. Even as a teenager, young Gilyard was bullying and beating women, including the first of his 4 wives, whom he married at age 17 when she got pregnant. She would later say that Gilyard subjected her to 5 years of torture before she escaped. He also compiled a numbing record of at least a dozen rape accusations. 5 charges failed to stick from 1969 until 1974. the last against a stripper. Finally, in 1975, he was brought up on charges of a 13-year-old girl, the daughter of a friend. He was sentenced to 9 months for molestation in a plea deal, but authorities blew an opportunity to get mental help for a clearly troubled man. A psychiatrist examined Gilyard as part of a competency test in that 1975 case, according to a profile of Gilyard by Mark Morris of the Kansas City Star. The shrink noted that the twisted Gilyard insisted that he, not the adolescent he was, a victim. The psychiatrist could have required Gilyard to get help. Instead, he wrote, "It is my recommendation that Mr. Gilyard would benefit from, but does not require, further psychotherapy, either individual or group in nature." There is no evidence that Gilyard received methodical mental health treatment, and his pattern of violence continued. He was charged in 1979 with a woman while holding a gun on her boyfriend. Despite compelling evidence, a jury acquitted him. In 1980, he was convicted of assaulting his third wife, who divorced him. He then stalked and beat her twice in 1981 while the case was under appeal. Ultimately, he served time for those assaults, as well as a parole violation related to a jewelry theft. Those cases finally put Gilyard behind bars in May 1982, just after Margaret Miller was killed, until January 1986, 2 months before the 8-murder spree began. Yet another sexual assault charge against Gilyard in 1989, this one involving a neighbor, led to a suspended sentence and probation under a plea bargain. That incident offered a glimpse into the depth of Gilyard's pathology. The victim and Gilyard had dined and shared a bottle of wine on Halloween Eve. He made sexual advances, and she demurred. He reacted, as usual, with violence. In the middle of the ordeal, the victim said, Gilyard held a knife to his own throat and threatened suicide unless she complied with his sexual demands. Under the plea deal, in that case, Gilyard was required to undergo sex and anger counseling, but it was too late for 12 of the 13 women he killed. Coincidentally, Gilyard became a garbage collector by trade after his release from prison in 1986. His boss at Deffenbaugh Disposal Service told reporters that Gilyard was punctual, personable, and reliable, and he had been promoted to a supervisory job. After 2 solid decades as a familiar face in Kansas City courtrooms, he seemed to go straight in 1989. Gilyard lived with his 4th wife, whom he married in 1991, in a small house on a dead-end street in South Kansas City. Neighbors told reporters that he rarely spent time outside, and his interactions with others on the block were curt or surly. By 2004, Gilyard must have been confident that he'd gotten away with murder. The investigation into the serial killings had been on ice for years, with forensic evidence sealed and stored. But his past finally caught up with him. Stored evidence from cold cases like the Kansas City murders has gone begging for testing since the advent of DNA crime-solving technology. But Kansas City police, like most departments in America, deplete their laboratory budgets on current cases. Few can afford the time and expense of testing swab samples from the victims of forgotten murders, especially those of prostitutes. But in 2003, Kansas City Police won a $111,000 federal grant to pay lab gumshoes overtime to run DNA tests on stored evidence from violent cold cases. Police had evidence stored in some 600 unsolved rapes and murders, and detectives narrowed that down to 85 cases that showed investigative promise. One of them was the murder of Naomi Kelly, the prostitute murdered in 1986. Over 13 months beginning in February 2003, the police scientists amassed 2,500 hours of overtime on nights and weekends in a DNA testing marathon. The work paid off when DNA from the same man was matched in evidence from each of the 8 murders from 1986 and 1987, along with the 5 others from 1977, 1980, 1982, 1989, and 1993. And on April 12, 2004, the white lab coats came up with a name to match the DNA. He was Lorenzo Gilyard, linked to the crimes by DNA extracted from hair or semen found on the victims. He had been right under the police department's nose all along. Gilyard was scrutinized in the serial killings because he was known to cavort with prostitutes, and streetwalkers told cops they were frightened of him. He had agreed to give a blood test in 1987, and cops tailed him at the time, but came up with nothing. As forensic DNA testing became more widespread in the 1990s, Kansas City police did not take a second look at the serial killing evidence until the federal grant gave them the financial motivation. Police began following Gilyard again 17 years later while prosecutors prepared a case. After a 5-day tail, detectives arrested him as he ate dinner at Denny's. It was likely his final meal as a free man. A few days after his arrest, a manacled Gilyard, solidly built but with graying hair and mustache, was led into a Kansas City courtroom for a brief hearing. The benches in the chamber were lined with relatives of the women he was accused of murdering. Some wept, but most merely stared. "He didn't look remorseful at all," one victim's sister told the Kansas City Star. Although Gilyard made a by-rote claim of innocence, he and his attorney plotted a defense strategy focused not on acquittal but on avoiding execution. After negotiations, Jackson County prosecutor Jim Kanatsar agreed that he would not seek the death penalty. In exchange, Gilyard agreed to a trial without a jury, and he surrendered most of his rights to appeal a guilty verdict. Kanatsar said that he made the agreement to ensure a quick, just, and final disposition. But he was also under pressure to win a conviction. In the fall of 2006, Judge John O'Malley threw out much of the evidence against Gilyard due to what he called sloppy work by Kansas City police, both in 1987 and after his arrest in 2004. Yet Kanatsar still had the idiot-proof DNA evidence, and that was the focus of Gilyard's trial in the spring of 2007. Kanatsar chose to prosecute Gilyard for 7 of the murders, all from the deadly spree of 1986 and 87. The victims were Ann Barnes, Catherine Berry, Kelly Ford, Carmeline Hibbs, Sheila Ingold, Naomi Kelly, and Angela Mayhew. DNA from semen evidence linked Gilyard to 6 of the 7 women, and a hair provided the evidence in the murder of Mayhew. It was a business-like proceeding, as trials without a jury often are. Gilyard, who seemed a shrunken shadow of the burly man he was when arrested, betrayed no emotion in court, even as Kanatsar delivered the damning DNA evidence that each of the women died shortly after having sex with the defendant. Defense attorney Thomas Jacquinot argued that Gilyard, who admitted of being a frequent customer of prostitutes, could have been a foil for a murderer who came along after he had sex with the women. But during closing arguments, Kanatsar countered, "The odds of some unknown person shadowing the defendant and killing those women immediately after he had sex with them defies logic." Judge O'Malley didn't buy it either. He convicted Gilyard of 6 counts of murder after a trial that lasted just a week. He was judged guilty of the 6 cases with DNA evidence and acquitted in the Mayhew murder. On April 13, 2007, he stood before O'Malley for his comeuppance. When the judge asked the defendant if he had anything to say, Gilyard spoke 8 nihilistic words. "No matter what I say, it doesn't matter." O'Malley then told Gilyard that he had forfeited any right to live out here among the rest of us. "Life without parole," the judge decreed, then repeated himself 5 times. Joe Lamb, who covered the trial for the Kansas City Star, wrote that Gilyard's lip quivered as he listened to O'Malley, his only reaction during the entire trial. O'Malley said, "I want Mr. Gilyard to get up every day for the rest of his life, look in the mirror, and say, 'This is what I've done. That's why I'm here.'" But the judge's idealized concept of a daily prison ritual would require a glimmer of conscience, something Lorenzo Gilyard never seemed to display in a lifetime of violence against women. As Gilyard shuffled off into the obscurity of the Missouri prison system, a few relatives of his victims spoke to the press outside the courthouse. One called the conviction, "a gift I thought we would never receive." Her gratitude is understandable, but it also indicates that the loved ones of murdered prostitutes have low expectations for justice. But should justice be so elusive in these cases, in this era of DNA evidence? Someone in the Kansas City Police Department made a curious decision by authorizing a publicity photo featuring members of its newly created cold case squad. In the photo, posted on the police website, the 7 men are pictured wearing untouchable-era fedoras while posed in a cooler amid blocks of ice. It may be true that some cold cases are solved with dogged work by clever detectives, but a more apt cold case publicity photo might show a lab tech using the RIFLIP technique, or restriction fragment length polymorphism, to compare DNA molecules. That is how the Gilyard case was solved, after languishing in Detective Bureau purgatory for decades. Similarly, DNA testing on old evidence brought Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, to justice in 2003, 21 years and countless detective hours after his spree began. Gilyard is serving his life sentence in Western Missouri Correctional Center. He has pleaded not guilty to the 12 murder charges.